Over 3 hours solving One Piece mysteries, and today I'm bringing you an incredible video about solving One Piece mysteries. This section where I take mysteries that haven't yet been solved in One Piece, but that have been posed by Oda, and I try to solve them by adhering to things said in the manga previously, so that in this way, we can get as close as possible to the real solution of this mystery that Oda has put into One Piece for us. And today I bring you over 3 hours of these mysteries, which I know if you've clicked on this video, it's probably to play it in the background while you're doing other things, like maybe you're eating. If so, enjoy your meal. Maybe you've put it on before going to sleep. If so, rest well, good night. Or maybe you're doing other things like chores, going to the gym, walking the dog. Anyway, so many things. I'd actually love for you to tell me in the comments what you're doing while this video's on, because you know I love reading your comments and I'm curious to see what you're doing. I just want to say these videos obviously take a lot of work, so I'd really appreciate you hitting like, subscribing, and hitting the hype button. Alright, I'll be quiet and leave you with over 3 hours of One Piece mystery solving. Let's start with the first mystery, and let's talk about the hieroglyphs of the Alabarna Palace. The Palace of Alabarna, in case anyone doesn't remember, is the palace we see in Arabasta, in the Arabasta arc. It is presented to us, the Palace of Alabarna, where the defeat of Crocodile by Luffy occurs, and where the poneglyph is that Robin reads, indicating the location of the ancient weapon Pluton. And this palace is one of the most important buildings in the entire history of One Piece, but it has gone very unnoticed. Surely because it was introduced in the Arabasta arc, which is at the beginning of the series, when we are not yet thinking that the story will go so far, or that it will even be so intricate and complicated in some aspects. The thing is that this building is so important because as far as we know, it is the oldest building, the oldest construction in general that we have in One Piece, since it dates back more than 4,000 years, meaning long before the Void Century, but much earlier. Just bear in mind that Zunisha is over 1,000 years old, and the palace is more than 4,000. I mean, that palace has been around for an incredible amount of time. I know many people were unaware of this fact, so just by mentioning it, I think you'll be alert to say, okay, what do they have to tell us here? Another important thing to highlight about this palace is that it is the residence of King Nefertari Cobra and the entire family. In other words, the entire Nefertari family has lived in that palace for a very long time. In fact, a detail that I find super interesting about the palace itself is that it even precedes the founding of the Kingdom of Arabasta. That is, the Kingdom of Arabasta did not exist when the Alabarna Palace was built. First the Alabarna Palace was built, and then the Kingdom of Arabasta. That is to say, first there was the palace, and then other things were formed around it, creating the Kingdom of Arabasta. But let's get to the most important point, which is that I'm going to tell you why I'm talking about this Alabarna Palace as one of the mysteries of One Piece, and one of the most important mysteries to solve. And we are going to the part of the underground ruins of the palace. And here I start to see things that are very interesting. Under the palace, we obviously have that pony glyph that marked the location of Pluton, which is obviously very important and something we have to take into account. But we are not going to talk about that pony glyph, as it is an external thing and could have been transported there. You'll tell me how they put it there and how they brought it. I don't know, maybe Kuma's fruit. We could go into another mystery because of that if you want, but the poneglyph is probably more modern than the palace and surely isn't the most important part of it. So imagine what I'm gonna tell you. The thing is, when we're in the palace ruins, both in the anime and in the manga, though it's obviously much clearer in the manga, we start to see some hieroglyphs marked on the wall. Obviously, this kingdom refers to Egypt, where we know there are a lot of hieroglyphs that many have not yet been deciphered and that tell stories from many years ago, so it's obvious that these refer to the same ones. The thing is, do you think these hieroglyphs don't refer to anything? Well, no, obviously they must refer to something. The question is, what? Several years ago I realized this. Several years ago I started looking at those hieroglyphs and started to see what they might mean. The thing is, obviously there are a lot and they're very interpretive like hieroglyphs always are, meaning they don't spell out in letters what you need to understand. It doesn't give you symbols, and from there, you figure it out. So I imagine that on the screen I am showing you some image of the hieroglyphs right now for you to keep in mind. And that you can even decipher something in the comments if you say this might mean this or something else might mean that. In fact, something curious is that you can see several boats and people seemingly fleeing in canoes or boats and such, and this perhaps could be related to the flood. I mean, the flooding of the world. We already know that the world has been flooding over time and such, and we don't know how long ago this started. So hey, perhaps it would be interesting if that were also carved there, narrating the flood a little. The truth is, it would be amazing, but of course we're at a point where we don't know what everything means, and obviously, although the video is about solving mysteries, I'm not going to try to solve what each of the hieroglyphs' hair means, because there are a ton, and as I said, they are very interpretative, so it would literally be a waste of time. But we can get interesting things from this, and we have to find out why the palace is over 4,000 years old. What is it doing there? What is in those hieroglyphs on the wall? Why? What are they placed there for? How long have they been there? Were they made with the palace before or after? What implication will this have in One Piece? And it seems to me that something absolutely key comes into play here that we've seen in the Elbaf arc, and that is that in the Elbaf arc, we've been shown 3 worlds. We have been shown the world that we are going to see now at the end of One Piece as that supposed final war that we are supposed to witness. We have been shown the second world, which is probably something like 800 years ago, the Void Century. And we have also been told about something that is the first world, which is something like the foundation that then, well, led to the Void Century and such. But it is the origin of everything, and I think the key is here. I believe that first world is probably something very close to those 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. I know at first you might think that those dates are quite distant. From here 800 years ago, and from 800 years to 4,000 or 5,000, there is a very large difference. Maybe it's not exactly like that, but I think it's pretty close. I think it's the closest option we have regarding this. So, I think that from this first world, we can already start to see that there were many more things than we can imagine. Many more things before those 800 years. Perhaps, and surely much more technology. Perhaps what Oda included from 4,000 or 5,000 years ago was not random, and he already included it thinking about that famous ending of One Piece that he has planned from the very beginning, and this would be one of the great proofs. I think it makes perfect sense. But of course, from this first world, initially, we are not told about Arabasta. We are not told about the palace, and I don't know if we can get anything more. What seems completely clear to me is that if we have already seen this first world, and we have seen this from 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, we now have 2 pieces in this giant puzzle that already tell us there is history back there. That is, there is history, there are things to tell, and there are things that are depicted within the manga to reveal things from even, as I say, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. I think one thing that is quite evident that will happen, or has already happened and will be revealed to us later, is that there will be more elements from 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. And it's true that we don't have many arcs left for the future, but it is certain that the arcs we have left seem interesting. We have more things from Elbaf, which we'll see if they tell us something. Maybe Mary Joy's, you know, that I think we could go to the moon or return to the Sky Islands at some point where they can indeed tell us things from a long time ago, and I think it would be a good point to start connecting dots from 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. It could even be that these dates also belong to certain things we have already seen in the work, but we have no idea because they haven't been told to us. And there are several elements throughout the plot that we do not know exactly where they come from, how old they are, nor have they been mentioned. It's not that they seem very important, but we know perfectly well how One Piece, a random house could appear somewhere. We don't pay attention, and they tell us that this house has been there for 5,000 years, and that the current city was built around it, and that would already make it important. So do you understand what I mean? But beyond this, I think we can draw something quite clear, even referencing the hieroglyphs. And with that mural from Elbaf, which already tells us things from a long time ago, from 800 years ago, and even further back, that palace in Alubarna probably tells us about events that happened shortly after or shortly before its construction, meaning in a pretty close period. So yes, we can conclude that this first world, second world, and third world have many similarities and that it seems like some kind of cycle. We can probably, by relating this cycle with the hieroglyphs and something that will be told to us later, uncover part of the story that Oda wants to tell us. In a subtle way, obviously, but I think several symbols that appear there can be interpretive, and we already know a bit where to direct them. We're not so lost. We're not thinking it could be option A, option B, option D, option E, or whatever. No, here we can understand that if everything is in a kind of cycle, we can figure out where things are headed, whether they go to the left, to the right, and roughly orient ourselves. So is this Alubarna Palace very important? Obviously yes. Are these hieroglyphics important as well? Well, 99% yes. I don't think Oda painted each one of those just because. And the key question of this mystery is it there just for the sake of it, or are we going to see more things? Well, I think the Elbaf arc has already given us the answer, and I believe it's going to go much further. So this palace is put here as proof of, hey, I've had this planned from the beginning. This land, this country, Arabasta, and Alubarna are going to be very important. Don't forget about it. I give you a hint. I throw 20 arcs ahead, and when you think I'm not gonna touch that topic, suddenly I do it in a way that blows your mind. So if you're watching this, well, you won't be as surprised. I just ruined the ending of One Piece for you probably. But anyway, you already know that this palace is important and that there are many things to tell from 4,000 years ago. So the question is, what makes them special? Here, from this point, we have to gather all the relevant information we have about the Buccaneer. And the first thing is, we know Kuma, who is a Buccaneer, and we know almost 90% of his story. Then from here, we can gather all the information about Kuma to try to find any trait of Kuma that seems a bit strange or doesn't belong, let's say, to reality. The first thing we know is that obviously they are very strong and all that stuff, okay? We have that clear, but I don't think the specialty or what makes this race different is that they are stronger. Honestly, it just doesn't quite fit for me. Despite the fact that yes, obviously strength is something important, but to call it a special race and not say it's stronger, it seems to me it has to be something a bit more complicated. We also have to consider that the world government seemingly hates or despises them or keeps them as slaves because they wanted to kill them or something like that. I mean, they were treated differently just because they were from that race, as if it were something a bit more complicated. I mean, if they were strong, okay, but it seems like they have some extra ability, so what can we take from this? And after thinking about it a lot, I believe the only thing we've seen different in Kuma, besides being a man as big as a bell of goodness, is that he was able to resist the lobotomization of robotization that Vegapunk did to him. And we know that Kuma gave his whole being 100% to protect Bonnie and became a pacifist, a soulless robot, and so on and so forth. But later we saw that this Kuma was able to have enough will to go to where Bonnie was, hit Saturn, and do what he had to do. So from here we can derive something important, and it is that in this strike against Saturn, we see that he has Haki, and Haki is nothing more than the representation of the user's own will. So this is something that shouldn't be. Let me explain. If Vegapunk left no remnant of Kuma's will in that being, and now Kuma is capable of emerging, and especially has the will with Haki, and they are trying to tell us that Kuma somehow is still alive in that. So why has he been able to resist that robotization that he has never been able to resist before? Because he wasn't playing a role. In fact, let's remember that in the Marineford War, he attacked Ivankov. This was obviously because he was robotized and lobotomized. So this character, why was he able to do that with Bonnie? Well, for me, the answer is simple, in quotes, even if it's a bit far-fetched. And it's that the Buccaneers, they have two souls, and where I'm going with this, I will relate it to the next mystery, which I think you'll understand better then. But it makes a lot of sense because if we think of Kuma as an entity with two souls, things start to make sense for us. We would perfectly understand why he was able to hit Saturn. If you think of Kuma as an entity that has two souls, let's say the robotization would have been able to consume the part of the original Kuma's soul, part 1, soul 1, so to speak, and would have been able to consume it. This would make Kuma robotized, and that he himself did not know that he had a second soul, since it is a characteristic that the Buccaneers surely had. But due to the extermination imposed on them by the world government, that thing was probably lost in their own knowledge. And if that is obviously not transmitted from generation to generation, then there is no way to know if it is real or not. And being a race that is somewhat erased from history and that no one knows anything about, well, we wouldn't have information. But when Kuma needed to protect Bonnie, he was able to awaken that second soul, something like an animal instinct, an instinct that is directly in the blood of the Buccaneer race, to live and have that active awareness. And this would allow him to go rescue Bonnie, activate the Haki, and be able to hit Saturn. Because even if it had Soul 1, Kuma's soul, the original, robotized, he had Soul 2 left, which is still the same Kuma but with a different soul, and this obviously has not been touched by Vegapunk, since Vegapunk, not having knowledge of this because he did not know the race well enough, was able to lobotomize Kuma but in Soul 1, which is normal for everyone in all people, and then would make this soul come to light. Some might think this doesn't make much sense, but think about it. What feature could make this race special if it's not something physical? I mean, physically they're like normal humans, a bit darker skinned, with longer hair, a bit stronger, and that would make them special. No, it seems it has to be something a bit different. They fixed on the fishmen, you immediately identify that it is a fishman and you know what abilities they have. A giant, you immediately identify what abilities they have. A mink, you immediately know what race it is and what abilities they have. On the other hand, with a Buccaneer, it is something that is a bit more challenging, so I think it has to be something a bit different. So for me, I see quite logically and quite obviously that this is the case, that the Buccaneers, the secret they have, for which they are so special, is that they have 2 souls. But let's move on to the third mystery, because here you will understand much better what I mean by the other thing, and it is another argument that I will use as a mystery, because it's a 2-for-1. And in the third mystery, we are going to talk about another character who probably also belongs to the Buccaneer race, and this is something you have heard many times, and it is Marshall D. Teach. And it is that Marshall D. Teach is a character that fits perfectly with what seems to be the Buccaneer race. A person with dark skin, dark curly hair, even somewhat long, although I don't know if they could cut it, I imagine they can, with a body. Large, robust, and seemingly very interested in ancient history as well, since Oda even said in an SBS that if he had a profession in the normal world, he would be an archaeologist. And indeed, there are several comments throughout the story about Teach's body that seem a bit interesting and could relate to this. And one of them is Marco, who was his doctor, because he was the doctor of Whitebeard's crew, to which Blackbeard belonged for a long time before brutally betraying them, said the following. And it's that he said Blackbeard had a special body so that, to say it. And indeed, he used the word special. He didn't know how to define what was happening in Kurohige's body, but he knew it was a different body, not like all his companions they had been examining. So this Kurohige, since he probably belongs to a different race, it would make perfect sense for him to be one of the Buccaneer. And despite Marco being a very intelligent person and having knowledge even of races like the Lunarian, which already rules out Kurohige being the Lunarian race, because if not, Marco would have known. This makes us think he belongs to a race that is a bit common and that even Marco does not know. And considering we mentioned that the Buccaneers seem to have excessive strength, it makes sense that their body is a bit different, that they have features, that they have larger organs, more small in other places, that their anatomy is a little different, and that makes them, well, special, so to speak. So of course, when Marco saw Kurohige and didn't know what race he was because he seemed like a normal human, just with a different body, he said he had a body special, making him belong to the Buccaneer race. Now, with Teach's body's mystery half solved, we have to move on to another curious phrase, and that is when we see Saturn mention, when he meets Katarina Devon and Vasco Shot, that Teach has a special lineage. And this is very important because, of course, if you think about what I said earlier, that the Buccaneers have 2 souls, it makes sense that Kurohige has been able to eat 2 fruits, right? I mean, if he had those 2 souls, then it makes sense that each soul could harbor a fruit, and this also makes the Buccaneers so powerful, because perhaps in the past there were many who were capable of consuming 2 fruits. The thing is, since that race was erased from history, people didn't know, and as we have seen, the Gorosei are so clueless that they didn't even know that the Gomu Gomu wasn't the Gomu Gomu, but rather the fruit of Nika, even though Luffy goes around shouting Gomu Gomu everywhere, and they didn't know that he had the Gomu Gomu, so it makes sense that no one found out. In fact, the Gorosei were not present at Marineford, and we didn't see their reaction upon seeing that Kurohige had 2 fruits. But the thing is that Saturn speaks of a special lineage, something even a bit different from what Kuma might be. So here's another addition to this theory, and it is that having complemented everything we have said about the Buccaneer race, about the 2 souls, with the justification of Kurohige with 2 fruits, this goes a bit into future theory and solves the matter of Teach's lineage for me. And it is that Teach knows the entire history of the Buccaneers, knows all that. That is why he could consume 2 fruits. That is why he put the blanket on and ate it, simply to create mystery. And the only thing he probably did was carry a fruit or something like that, eat it from inside, and that's it, simply to create mystery. So no one knows exactly how he did it. And this would explain why he was so determined to do it, because he already knew there were people who had done it and had not had. No problem at all due to his race. And above all, if we think of Teach as a person with a special lineage, we might think that instead of having 2 souls, he has 3, which would make him of special lineage, and especially would allow him to consume a 3rd fruit in the future, making him a complete Buccaneer. Definitive. Imagine that Kurohige reveals to us that he is from the Buccaneer race, that the Buccaneers can consume 2 fruits, that he is on a completely different level, and when we think he has 2, we suddenly see him pull out a 3rd, and he tells us that he is from a special lineage, or that he is a special case, and instead of having 2 souls, he has 3. This would explain the personality changes he has, because he would have 3 different souls, but he would even be able to consume a 3rd fruit because of this. And this, for me, makes a lot of sense. Because you justify Kuma, you justify the Buccaneer race, you justify the fruit, you justify Teach, you justify everything just with the topic of the implementation of souls with a race. different. And for me, it fits a lot. I mean, I consider this third mystery closed, and well, let me know in the comments what you think, but let's move on to the fourth. Let's move on to the fourth mystery, and we're going to something that's a bit crazy. We're going with a touch of madness, and we're heading to the Reverse Mountain. And it's in the first moment of the series. When we leave Logtown and head towards the Reverse Mountain, we see that the Mugiwara crew climb the Reverse Mountain, and pay attention because in the manga you can see that there are structures like some arches of stone with some marked symbols and something curious. And you say, wait a minute, what is this? What does it mean? What is this doing here? And as I said, you see these stone arches with some symbols that no matter how much I tried to analyze them, honestly, I haven't found any meaning because they are not completely visible from the... Alright, or maybe they cannot be interpreted, but anyway, they remind me of other engravings and other things we have seen throughout the series, meaning they probably come from the same source. But here the important thing is who made this, when they did it, how they did it. I mean, this is extremely important because of course we have seen that the Reverse Mountain is something that normally when people cross it, it's a one-way trip, and to return, well, they have to manage it differently, which for now does not know. But the Reverse Mountain has those lanes that go in only one direction. So who built that, and how did they built it? And this makes one think, is the Reverse Mountain artificial? Well, the most important thing is to find out where these constructions come from. These constructions are obviously not made naturally. The Reverse Mountain yes, that I don't know, because the world of One Piece is very crazy, although the Reverse Mountain is also very strange. Very strange, very strange. But these stone arches are clearly made artificially, made by someone. And as I say, if throughout the work of One Piece we have seen different carvings in other places, then who is to say that this wasn't done by the same group of people? That there isn't a group of people, which will be revealed to us later, who dedicated themselves to placing these engravings in different places. So I think the key would be to find out why this is the way it is. And seeing all the ancient technology that seems to exist in One Piece and everything, it already makes us wonder if the Reverse Mountain could be created by someone, the ancient kingdom or something like that. And not only think that maybe the Reverse Mountain is indeed made naturally, but that these arches are placed there to mark something, to signify something, and it is there because there used to be people who took care of that. Nowadays we have Crocus, who is watching over the lighthouse at Twin Capes and is responsible for monitoring who comes in and who goes out and such. But who's to say that many years ago there weren't other people in charge of this and they were the ones who built them? And this makes a lot of sense. If we think of the world of One Piece as something somewhat orderly, not so wild with the era of piracy and everything more or less controlled, it could be that there were some kind of guards, something like when we got to Skypiea, where there was a woman who told us sort of how much we had to pay. It makes a lot of sense that you would stop to look at them and such, because really you can't. So to me it seems more decorative and simply for something important. I mean, I think that place, the exit of the Reverse Mountain or the Reverse Mountain itself, was something important for the people, which as I say makes me think that this is artificially constructed simply because it was something people naturally, recurrently used to enter there and to sail. Perhaps, as I say, everything was a bit more controlled in this sense, but people were also freer to travel, or there was more peace, because right now many people don't want to go to the Grand Line due to the fear it causes them, due to how things are portrayed from the outside, and there are many very powerful people, many criminals, and many pirates. But of course, if this used to be a free world, but everyone behaved well, and there was security, and everyone was free to go wherever, I would like to without fear, and only with the desire to enjoy, then it makes sense that they had that controlled entrance to justify who enters, who leaves, and that they also had it a bit decorated, just for pure decoration, so the entrance isn't so shabby. It's like, welcome to the Grand Line. So I honestly wouldn't pay much attention to these arcs as such, but I think they will indeed be part of the world building Oda wants to convey to us. The world of One Piece from so many years ago, just like we talked about the 5,000 years of the Uvarma. Well, who tells you that this is not 5,000 years old and belongs to that first world of One Piece we've talked about, which was mentioned in the text of Elbaf, and for me it makes a lot of sense beyond 800 years ago. That first world of One Piece probably has a lot of things, and Reverse Mountain, which is surely one of the things that hasn't been able to sink over time, well, these structures remain and are part of all that. In short, these arcs are very important for what Oda will want to tell us, but they won't be anything totally key and defining, in my opinion. But hey, if you think differently, let me know in the comments. Now let's move on to the fifth and final mystery. And now let's talk about something that was mentioned to us on the island of Jaya. And the island of Jaya, besides being an arc that I like, quite a bit together with Skypiea. I hope you all like Skypiea or you won't be in the know. There we have the character Bellamy, who talks about different things and has some rather curious dialogues. And we see that he mentions 3 things. He mentions the One Piece, he mentions the Sky Island, and he mentions the Emerald Island, referring to these as things that that are lies, that are not real and are just child's play, like made up stories. And obviously we already know that the One Piece exists. We already know that the Sky Island exists, which would lead us to think that the Emerald Island indeed, that it exists. So what about this? Are we gonna see the Emerald Island or are we not going to see it, but rather what happens with all this? Explanation. Well, to me it seems quite obvious, quite clear that the Emerald Island exists. Now, are we gonna see it? Well, maybe not, because let's see. We don't have many arcs left in One Piece, let's be realistic. What arcs do we approximately have left in One Piece? The Elbaf arc, according to me, Moon and or Sky Islands, Hachinosu, an arc of the Revolutionaries. If Oda wants to include it, Mary Joy's, Lodestar, and Laugh Tale. From here, we can rule out many points that have nothing to do with the Emerald Island. Elbaf doesn't seem likely. Mary Joy's doesn't seem likely. Hachinosu doesn't seem likely. Laugh Tale is neither. So what would we have left? Lodestar, something about the Moon or the Sky Islands, which is already very far-fetched, but well, we only have Lodestar left. Lodestar, could it be that Lodestar is the Emerald Island? Yes, but I think that would be more popular, right? I mean, it's just a normal island at first. We don't have much information about the island. Well, none, other than it's the last island of the Grand Line. But if it were an Emerald Island, it would be very important and stuff, and I don't know what else. I mean, there would have been more talk about that island. That's the feeling I get. So I get the impression that we won't see that island, but it exists and they will show it to us. About Emerald Island, I don't think it's an island entirely made of emeralds, though it could be. Who knows? And I don't know, but my interpretation is that it's an island that has some emerald tone, some green tone, or something that makes it seem like it's emerald. Now, the interpretation I have of this island is a very simple option. Really? What I'm gonna say is very simple, and I think it's quite likely, and that, well, this might indeed open the door for us to see it, although I wouldn't exactly understand when. And it is basically that it is a completely ice island at the pole, north, or at the South Pole. I don't remember which one was colder, and you know who else didn't remember? Buggy and Shanks. And we see Buggy and Shanks arguing about which pole is colder, to which Rayleigh decides to punch each of them to end the argument. But the important thing about this is that it is empirically shown in the manga that the North Pole and South Pole exist. That is something completely obvious and completely concrete. I mean, they say it and it exists. Okay, so having the existence of these things, to me, it makes sense for it to be an ice island. And someone's going to say, okay, but what does an ice island have to do with Emerald Island? They're confusing ice with emeralds. No, but it would make sense for it to happen if a curious phenomenon occurs. And it's that we know that in very cold places, auroras can occur, which can make the ice turn green. So if we have an ice island in One Piece affected by a very large aurora, because we know that crazy things can happen in One Piece, then a massive aurora, which we haven't seen in One Piece, and it would be beautiful to see it, reflecting directly on the ice and making a green island. If we come from afar, it may seem that this island is the Emerald Island, which would be incredible. Now, the problem I see with this, the theory seems to me spectacular. I think it makes all the sense in the world and is very logical. It's about when we are going to go or how we are going to go. I mean, why will we go to that island and why and when and where? I mean, it's very strange. I mean, there are many questions. How do you fit that island into One Piece now? Myself? We are in Elbaf. We have to go to the other islands I told you about. How do we get to the North Pole, the South Pole, to that island? And why do we go? And how do we end up there? Sounds more like a movie, right? Maybe they'll make a movie. One Piece, Emerald Island. It could be. I mean, it could be. So the question is, will Oda show it in the manga? Man, I think so. In the manga? Yes. Now, that we go with the Mugiwara crew, that's more complicated. And now we have to see how they show it to us. Because if it's not God Valley, how are they going to show it? We've already had a flashback of Roger, more or less. I don't know if we'll get Roger's complete journey 100%. I don't know what other characters can be shown to us who have gone to those islands. And we don't have many pirates left. Maybe Zebek. And the most key thing about Zebek is God Valley. It seems... I don't know if it will be Scopper Gaben who went alone, the man with the scar. If it is not Scopper Gaben with the road poneglyph that tells us he lives on Emerald Island, what? You know, maybe we have to go to Emerald Island because there's a man there with a ship that has the road poneglyph. It might be a way to extend the story a bit by going there, but right now, I don't know exactly where it is. So this is kind of the idea I have about Emerald Island, that I think we will see it in the manga, but I don't know exactly How? So here in the comments, I want you to tell me how you would logically place in the manga the thing about the Emerald Island. Like, how would you say, hey, well, for me, if they do this, this, and this, it makes sense, it's logical and correct. I don't know, leave it in the comments, because it's something that, from the very beginning of One Piece, from the East Blue, is already presented to us. It's something that's hinted at as if it's about to happen, but over 1,000 chapters have passed and it still hasn't happened. And to this day, when we look to the horizon, we're not able to foresee when this will occur. And the mystery I'm talking about is when the Mihawk versus Zoro will happen. From the East Blue, from the very first moment we reach the Baratie arc, a very powerful character appears. The best swordsman in the world, Draculae Mihawk, with a black sword, with the sword Yoru, and he is a character who brutally humiliates Zoro simply with a knife, hinting that at some point these two will face off, and that Zoro will have to surpass Mihawk to become the greatest swordsman. Strongest in the world. Well, years have passed, arcs have passed, many trainings have passed. In fact, Zoro has trained under the tutelage of Draculae Mihawk himself. But to this day, we don't see a clear date for when these two will have a confrontation. And it's not just that we don't see a clear date, it's that we haven't even been given any details, not even a hint of the possibility of a fight between these two, and we don't even know what path will be taken for these two to fight. Since most people, when you ask them, take for granted that at some point they will have to face each other, but no one can argue in a more or less logical way with the plot why they should face each other. Beyond the possibility that it might simply be a fight at the end of the manga, there are many other possibilities. For example, I've heard that Shiryu of the Rain, who is Blackbeard's swordsman, will face Mihawk, defeat him, obtain a black sword, and Zoro will have to face him to surpass him. And since Shiryu would have surpassed Mihawk, when Zoro defeats Shiryu, this would mean that Zoro is the best swordsman in the world. And like this, there are 1,000 theories, but then what about this? What about the mystery? When will Mihawk versus Zoro really happen? And will it happen? Well, about whether it will happen, it's quite clear that it will, because as I said, since the East Blue, this confrontation has been hinted at. We are being directly told that these two characters have to face each other at some point, and we have to see Zoro's training curve and power growth to get as close as possible to Mihawk and thus defeat him. It is something that has been told to us for a long time. Zoro wants to be the best swordsman in the world, and for that, he must defeat the best. It's not enough for him to defeat just anyone. He must defeat Mihawk. The first thing I will do is dismiss the theory that Shiryu or another person will be able to defeat Draculae Mihawk. As of today, I find this quite difficult for several reasons. The first and most important thing is that we have never seen this character fight seriously. Never. The closest we saw was when he played a bit with Vista in the Marineford arc and fought a little with him when he was obviously just playing. And Vista, who was quite a powerful swordsman, well, he held on a bit, but it wasn't a big deal since it was very noticeable that Mihawk was playing. Therefore, if we have more than 1,000 chapters and this character has not fought, at some point Oda is going to reveal his strength because he himself has attributed the name of the most powerful swordsman in the world to him. And this is something he has planned since East Blue. It's not something that occurred to him halfway through the story and suddenly included. No, he introduced this character, directly named him as the most powerful character in the art of the sword, and made this character the final obstacle for Zoro to overcome and become the best swordsman in the world. So for me, this character must show us his power at some point, and if we directly set up a fight for the few chapters left in the series, let's understand few in quotes, because, well, we don't have 1,000 chapters left, I suppose, right? So, I don't see there being enough time for Mihawk to demonstrate his power against someone who really has a narrative sense that he can fully develop his power and show it, and then face Shiryu and even lose. It seems like there's not enough time for all that to happen in the few chapters left, unless they start right away. And obviously, they're not going to pit him against Shiryu and have him lose right off the bat. I mean, we're not going to see Mihawk's power against Shiryu and have him lose in the first fight we see, because that would make him the biggest fraud in history. Imagine they present us with the best swordsman in the world since the East Blue arc, and the first fight we see against Shiryu, he loses. It would be a bit disappointing. Well, not a bit. It would be very disappointing. And another thing to mention is that I don't see Shiryu as a real threat. I mean, Shiryu is going to be a very powerful character. He does have an impressive ability, which is invisibility. But as of today, do you think this character is at the level of the best swordsman in the world? I haven't seen him demonstrate any feats, and I haven't even seen Oda hint at it. Just as we have seen other Blackbeard characters who have certain power and are quite dangerous, I think if they had a character in Blackbeard's crew capable of defeating Draculae Mihawk, I think they would have hinted at it. They would have shown us that this character was on a completely different level from the rest of the crew or something like that. But as of today, I find it quite complicated because also the ability he has, which is invisibility, unless he awakens it and is even able to ignore Haki, Mihawk probably has observation Haki quite advanced, especially because of the scene we had in Marineford when he sees Luffy and makes him understand that if Luffy attacks him, he will cut off his arms, since that implies it's like a Haki from Mihawk that he sends to Luffy, or something like that. So it doesn't matter if he's invisible because he could detect his presence with Haki. So, I don't know how powerful this ability is, at least against a character like Mihawk. So this theory, as I say, I would dismiss a bit and would go directly to thinking about how the final confrontation between these two could happen. As of today, it doesn't seem like they will have a rival confrontation as enemies, since the Cross Guild crew, which is precisely where Mihawk is a crew that is more focused on comedy and parody, even though, in my opinion, what they do by hunting Marines is super interesting. And that they have characters like Crocodile or Mihawk who are very powerful, but if the captain is who he is, then we understand that the crew is not going to be a 100% serious confrontation against the Straw Hats. At most, they could have a Davy back fight, which I would like, but I don't know if that would serve to define them as the best swordsmen in a fight. So I get the feeling that the fight between these two at least won't come from friendship or direct rivalry between the crews, but it has to be something extra. And I get the feeling that maybe it could be after the end of One Piece, since initially the end of Zoro's journey depends on two things. The first is that Luffy becomes the king of the pirates, and the second is that he becomes the best swordsman in the world. And in this way, if Zoro becomes the best swordsman in the world, and then Luffy obtains the One Piece, well, if we then have a final war, maybe he won't be on his side, or maybe he'll retire from piracy because he would have accomplished everything. So it would be a bit strange to create the final part of the story with a Zoro who would have already achieved everything. On the other hand, if Luffy gets the One Piece, Zoro would still have his goal in mind and would want to be the best swordsman in the world. So what would he do? Well, keep training and go challenge the person in question. So, my way of seeing it is that after that famous final war that is going to happen, and I think it's quite evident, Zoro will go directly to Mihawk and tell him that he challenges him, that now he is ready, and we might not see the entire fight 100% because we know that Oda doesn't really enjoy drawing fights, as he has said. That's why he included Gear 5 directly in the One Piece manga, to draw fights in a different way. As I said, he mentioned this, and we would have a scene where Zoro is able to defeat Mihawk, becoming the best swordsman in the world, creating something very beautiful, very symbolic, and an easy way to understand that Zoro has fulfilled his dream, since the most important thing about Zoro's character is that he fulfills the dream. But once he goes to face Mihawk, the fight is not going to be that intriguing, because if we are at the end of One Piece, it is quite obvious that he is going to win. So my way of seeing it is that Oda is going to do it this way. If someone in the comments thinks differently with data from the manga, let me know in the comments. Let's move on to the next mystery. With the next mystery, we go to something I've mentioned several times on the channel, which is a bit of a meme on the channel, and it's that I always say the moon in One Piece is very important. I've always commented that the moon is something Oda has been showing us for several years, introducing certain curiosities, and at some point I think the Straw Hats are going to go to the moon. But here I'm not going to talk about whether the Straw Hats are going to the moon or not. That's another thing. I'm going to talk about the main mystery about what happens with the moon, what importance the moon has in One Piece. Some might be caught off guard, not understanding what I'm talking about, so I'm going to give you several details from the manga. First of all, we have a complete minister from Enel's journey. Enel, to the surprise of many people who might not know, did not die after Scipioea. He has a mini-story in which, with the Arc Maxim, he travels to the moon, which he calls Fairy Vare, and when he arrives there, he encounters some kind of aliens, resurrects an army of robots that had gone there because the person who made them had died, having choked on a Kiri Dango while watching the moon and saw an explosion. Yes, this is a joke, but that's exactly how it is. And Enel, when he arrives on the moon, finds them, revives them with electricity, and finds two very interesting murals, which are certainly similar to what we saw in Elbaf. And then he also finds a kind of citadel where he activates his energy and generates a bunch of robots, which interestingly, the robots we have on the moon are exactly the same as the ones I mentioned that come from Earth. Exactly the same. And at the end of the mini-story, we see Enel, who is the leader of that army of soldiers, who have a spear quite similar to the one Nika might have. And if that weren't enough, we have multiple panels of important characters with the moon. The most well-known is the one with Luffy's Gear 5 along with the moon, which, as you know, obviously isn't there just by chance. Then we have the entire Mink race, who interestingly develop the science of their power and undergo a completely crazy transformation when they look at the moon, which is full. Once again, the moon is involved, and I could keep pointing out small details from Oda with the moon, as there are quite a few in One Piece. But then, what about this? What about the moon? What does Oda want to do? Well, for me it's quite simple, and I'm not going to explain in hyper-detailed fashion what importance the moon has by explaining everything too much in detail, because I think I would go on too long and end up touching on other topics that would need to be addressed, but that would stray a bit from the moon. And I will try to explain it in the simplest, most summarized way so that everyone listening to this can understand me perfectly. I believe the moon is very important, especially for the Void Century and possibly even further back. And when I talk about further back, I mean, for example, 1,000 years ago, which would be, for example, the first world of the Elba mural. What I'm getting at with all this is that the civilization Enel found is not there by chance. Oda did not bother, while he was doing the Eastlove and Water St. Arcs, which is when this mini-story takes place, to send Enel to the moon because he was bored and take him there to find a civilization, some aliens, some robots, and on top of that, those robots had already been replicated on Earth. It's something quite complicated, quite curious, and too well thought out to be done just for the sake of it, especially considering that he arrives there and finds two murals that already explained a bit of the history to us. And we found some ruins with a civilization, a citadel, or whatever you want to call it, where there are robots that Enel is able to activate with his fruit, which is very curious and very interesting as well. So, as I say, for me the simple answer is that it probably comes from before the Void Century. It could be from 800 years ago, but seeing it from the first world of Elbaf and seeing that there are various constructions, like the Alabarna Palace, which is 5,000 years old, well, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it's quite logical to think that those ruins we have on the moon come, well, for example, from 100 years ago, 4,000, but from a date we are not able to glimpse, of which we still have no information other than the mural and a few trivial details we have had. Because it is true that in Skypiea we were taught many things, that the character of Enel is going to be key to why he went to the moon, because this is important. Enel did not go to the moon just for the sake of it. I mean, he didn't end up there by accident. He built the Ark Maxim, which is a spacecraft in its entirety, because he literally went to space, because he saw it somewhere, because he knew how to do it. So where did he get this information? That's important. They have to tell us that. Why did Enel go to the moon? Why didn't another character go? Why did such a curious and important character like Enel go? He perceived himself as a god. He called himself a god, a character who didn't care about destroying all of Skypiea just to go to the moon, to go to Fairy Vare, something that a god like him felt he had to go to. It was the Promised Land. Why? Where did he get this information? This is very important. Why a character like Enel from the Sky Islands? Why haven't we revisited the topic of the Sky Islands in One Piece? Could it be that we will touch on it after Elbaf? I honestly think so. In fact, Enel's return is imminent in One Piece. I don't know how long it might take. In One Piece time, 2 years isn't that much, but I'm telling you, it won't be long before Enel returns. And as I say, I could start developing my theory about what I think the Citadel, the aliens, the moon, and all this are, but that would already be, as I say, going into explaining the entire Void Century and everything before, explaining the first world, and explaining my theory about that. The only thing I want to say with this is that the moon is very important in One Piece, that you keep it in mind, and that the mystery of the moon, as I say, comes from much further back than we have enough information to be able to develop something logical. And that moon was Oda's first stone to start building the ancient history of One Piece. And it was simply like a marker to say, when we are at the end of the work, remember that I've placed this red dot here, and you will see that this red dot is very important to take another path that will lead us to solve all the mysteries of One Piece, of things that we are not able to develop and extract information from today. So this is what I think about the whole mystery of the moon in One Piece. Leave me a comment if you have any ideas, and let's move on to the next mystery. Let's now move on to something very curious, something that somewhat divides the community, and a quite interesting mystery, because I think it's something that goes even more outside the work than within it, but that will obviously also have many repercussions in the work. And it's whether Luffy will have a Gear 6, a new mark, or a new transformation. This is very important. Well, as I said, this has divided the community. Some people think yes, some people think no, and the mystery is basically about what Ova is going to do. Well, I have mentioned this before. I will try to explain myself a little better. I will try to elaborate a bit more on the answer. And for me, it is quite evident that there will be either a 6th gear or a variation of the 5th or an improvement of the 5th, but there will be something different, something that probably changes it visually, something that is not the Luffy with the appearance we have today, but rather something extra, one more thing, one more gear, so to speak. Some might think, hey, why? If the 5th gear, Gear 5, is simply the awakened fruit, Nika's maximum power, it's the most we've seen. Why? It doesn't make sense. And I totally agree with these people. I understand that from one point of view, from the work, you might say, it doesn't make sense to go beyond the awakening of the fruit, it's the most we know. And I think here's the important concept for Oda to play with us, what we know. And that is very important because Oda, as I say, gives us the information he wants in the way he wants. The awakening of the fruits, until it was mentioned in One Piece, seemed simply like a rumor, like a theory, or something a bit crazy. And it seemed like, well, you had the fruits, you had more power, less, and that was it. But when they started talking about the awakening in a new way, everyone went crazy, and it changed the way we saw all the fruits, simply with one word, simply with a demonstration of the power of what the awakening was capable of. So who tells you that Oda won't come up with something new to make that fruit reach a level that almost no one can reach? Because only the mythical fruits do, for example, to explain it like that. I know many of you will say that this is just a theory and that I'm not basing it on anything. Well, I'm going to base it on the most important thing of all, which is that One Piece is a manga. I mean, as of today, which is the 28th of July, 2025, One Piece has, at the very least, 5 years left. And I think it will take more. I think it has 7, 8, or whatever. But well, it has quite a few years left. Gear 5 in the manga appeared exactly on the 28th of March, 2022. That is to say, almost 3.5 years have already passed. Do you think that from now until the end of One Piece, which would make a total of 8 years, because let's say at least it's 5, it would end in 2030, from 2022 to 2030 is 8 years. Do you think that in 8 years, in the epic final battle he will have against IMU, BLACKBEARD, or whoever you think, I think BLACKBEARD, I've been saying it for many years, do you think Luffy won't have a new transformation? Do you think he won't have a new form? I find it very difficult because, as I say, it's a manga, and I don't care if it's One Piece, the best-selling manga in history. They all follow the same rules and all have things to do. Obviously, for the viewer, it's very important to have a surprise in the final battle, to have that typical moment, the typical moment of Goku Super Saiyan, of Gohan Super Saiyan 2, of Goku Super Saiyan 3, the typical moment in all mangas where the protagonist suddenly transforms in the final battle when it's most needed and is able to defeat the enemy. Why? Because it already happened with Kaido. With Kaido, which is the most important battle Luffy has had, what happened? Well, he suddenly transformed and was able to defeat Kaido, so something very similar is going to happen with BLACKBEARD, IMU, or whoever the final villain is. And beyond all this, I mean, he won't be stuck for 7, 8, 9, 10 years with the same transformation and won't develop a new one, because a new transformation equals a lot of money. Easy and simple. The 5th gear has made a lot of money on its own. Figures, posters, scenes, decorations. All the marketing that can be done related to the 5th gear equals money. They release a new generation every few years. Why? Because every time they release 100, 150 new Pokemon, they sell more plush toys, more t-shirts, more of everything. These are new things that people want to see and want to have. Because you like some, you don't like others, and it generates comments, it generates things. And Pokemon knows a thing or two about marketing and making money. Lately, they haven't been making good games, honestly, those scoundrels. But what I'm getting at is exactly that. The amount of money that would be made with a new March is so evident that it has to happen in the final arc. And I know many of you will say, no, Oda already has a lot of money. Oda isn't motivated by money. I completely agree. Oda doesn't need to do that for money. And if Oda wanted money, he would do many other things that would give him more money. But Oda also has other responsibilities, as he is under the command of certain people like the magazine Weekly Shonen Jump, which is where the One Piece manga is published. Let's say that magazine is not going through its best moment. They have several new mangas that keep getting canceled, and what practically sustains the magazine is One Piece. Therefore, what they are going to try with One Piece is to squeeze as much as possible out of it, and these people and many others will pressure Oda to release a new transformation, because as the final saga approaches, they will keep saying, hey, Luffy should have another transformation by now, right? Hey, Luffy must be in another form, hey. It seems quite evident and logical to me that this is going to happen. And if I don't give you the example of the fourth gear came out, and Oda, what did he do? Since he probably knew it was quite a while until the fifth, he introduced the Bonesman, introduced the Snakeman and the Tankman, and with that, well, he managed for a long time. When Snakeman came out, people went crazy. In the manga, we were saying, wow, incredible, a new form of Luffy, the Snakeman, how cool. And then in the Wano arc, he introduced the fifth gear. I'm not saying the sixth gear is coming already because this is something different from the fourth, but I'm telling you that from now until the end of One Piece, there will be another one. As I said, you can leave everything you want about this in the comments, whether you think yes or no, leave it in the comments with arguments, and now let's move on to the next mystery. And now let's go with something very curious, because the One Piece community regarding this mystery has changed a lot. There has been a very radical change, and we are going to talk about Zoro's left eye. As we know, Zoro has an eye that after the time skip, well, he has it closed, it has a scar, and he hasn't opened it until now. And there are many theories about the eye, but many. The thing is that when Zoro's eye appeared, for example, 80% of people thought he was going to open it at some point. This was right when the design came out. And 20% who believed that no, it was just a design and that's it. And as the chapters have progressed, instead of 80% of people believing he will open it and 20% who, it has shifted to 20% who believe he will open it and 80% who do not. I am in that 20%, I believe he will open the eye, but to be honest, the reason I think Zoro will open the eye is simply that I don't want to get off the boat of him opening it, because I've been on that boat from the beginning of him opening the eye. So I have to be realistic and stick directly to the facts. And objectively, it's quite likely that Zoro won't open his eye. As I said, I'm not getting off the ship that he will open it, and I'm literally on fire. The ship is sinking, and I'm already burning and drowning. But I won't get off the ship until Oda finishes the manga. So let's see, why doesn't it make sense for Zoro to open his eye? Well, it's very simple. Let's go to the Wano arc. In the Wano arc, Zoro has had the two most difficult confrontations he has faced up to the date of this video's recording, against King and against Kaido. Zoro has fought with a Yonko, with the strongest pirate in the world at that moment, the most powerful creature among the characters who were alive. He faced him, withstood an attack from Big Mom and Kaido, and gave Kaido a scar. Then, with I don't know how many broken bones, he faced King and won as well. In fact, he even saw the Grim Reaper, and it appeared to him, and I don't know what happened with that. And at no point, after all these feats that drove me completely crazy as a fan of Zoro, which you all should be, not only did he not open his eye, but he didn't even make a hint or a comment, nothing at all, as if there was absolutely nothing with the eye, which is most likely to be honest. So, let's see. As I say, I hope that the final war comes, that there is a confrontation against Mihawk or whatever, and that Zoro opens his eye and suddenly becomes super strong and suddenly has something incredible there, and that it's a pact with a demon that he has sealed, which is kind of the idea I have, that the eye has been sealed and that's it. And there are several characters in the world of One Piece who have a scar but have their eye open. Sabo, Rayleigh, Shanks too. There are several characters who have their eye open with a scar, and Zoro could be one of them as well. But of course, those data and these theories go a bit down the drain when you start thinking about what I said, that if in the Wano arc he had two top-level world confrontations with the most powerful first commander of all, who was probably King, and the strongest pirate of all at that moment, who was Kaido, and at no point, as I say, it's not that he didn't open the eye, it's that he didn't even make a move. Well, it's a bit concerning, and you look at it and say, well, it doesn't seem like he's going to open it. So as I said, I am sticking to the data and sticking to the things from the manga, as I already told you that the idea of the video is to solve the mysteries according to the things from the manga and according to what is closest to the canon that we have. And the closest to the canon that I have is, well, a Zoro who hasn't said anything at any moment and hasn't even made a hint. So I can't rely on anything, folks. I would love to tell you that I have 1,000 arguments to think yes, and I do have some things, but being objective, I have to be a bit negative and say, folks, Zoro probably won't open his eye. Now, I repeat, I'm not abandoning the ship. If you are in favor of Zoro opening his eye because you prefer to go down with the ship rather than jump off like a rat, let me know in the comments. And if you think Zoro won't open it, well, that too. Anything in the comments. Next mystery. And now we go with the mystery that, in my opinion, is the most interesting of the whole video. Really, I think this is very interesting, and there will be quite a few curious opinions in the comments, and quite a few people, I suppose, who will not only have different ideas, but also ideas that complement my idea. And the main mystery is, what are the ancient weapons? And when I say what are they? On component placement, I don't mean Shirahoshi is Poseidon, so is that Poseidon, right? Shirahoshi, no. I mean in concept. I'm not referring to whether Pluton is a ship, if Uranus is the weapon of Lulusia. No, I mean as a whole. What are they? Why were they created? That's what I mean. That is the whole set. What are they used for? They can serve as weapons, and that's why they are called ancient weapons. Obviously, yes, but a kitchen knife is used for cooking and can also be used to harm someone, so that explanation doesn't work for me. What I'm getting at is exactly what I'm telling you. For what purpose were the ancient weapons created? What are they for? What are they? And here I'm going to take a risk because obviously we don't know what they are in the sense that we haven't seen Pluto, we haven't seen Uranus, we have no confirmation of anything. The closest we have is Poseidon. So, what about all this? What are they for? Well, as I said, many people think they are simply weapons because they are called ancient weapons. All the characters have referred to them exactly the same way, ancient weapons, and we have seen that they are used, well, to cause harm. Uranus could be the weapon of Lulusia, then Pluto is used to eliminate islands with one shot. Poseidon also has the Sea Kings, which are a very powerful weapon, but I go a bit further and I think this is not the case. This is somewhat similar to what I have mentioned about the fruits, and it's that I have commented that the fruits are not necessarily weapons, but they are made for something else, which is a bit of the theory I have about the fruits. However, people, humans, use them as weapons because that's human nature, that anything that can be used as a weapon will end up being used as a weapon, and if this is done with very great destruction or with very great power, then it will be classified as a weapon. And I think the same can happen with the ancient weapons. I believe that the ancient weapons, perhaps, for example, I'll give you the example of Poseidon, was not made as a weapon. I don't even know if I should say created because I don't know the origin, but it wasn't a weapon. Its main use is not to be a weapon. I mean, you see Shirahoshi and see that she is capable of controlling the Sea Kings, and notice what the first thing we saw her do with this power was. Stop the Noah's Ark from destroying Fishman Island. Something good, something to save it. So why is this a weapon, right? I mean, if it's a weapon, it should be to defend yourself, to cause harm, and simply that. But what she did was defend herself. She used it for something else. So they already showed us that the ancient weapons are not only used as weapons, not only for defense or causing harm, but they can serve other functions, and this is the first time we see an ancient weapon in action. So what is the exact function of the three weapons? Obviously I don't know, but I think it's something that in the ancient kingdom, or maybe before the 800 years, as I say, and as I have said before, those 3,000 years, 5,000, whatever from the first world, those things we know as weapons, at first they were not. Simply, they were things that existed or were created, each fulfilling a different role. For example, a person who was capable of manipulating Sea Kings could use it to protect ships by placing a Sea King on each side of the ship to guide it to Fishman Island. In this way, they would not suffer damage or attacks like the Kraken or other fish, as we saw when the Straw Hats went down. They could use them for protection, they could use them for 1,000 things we can't think of. The ship of Pluton, which we have been told was very large and could destroy islands with a single shot, aside from that fact being mentioned by Crocodile as a kind of rumor, and we don't even know if it's true, could simply serve to eliminate drifting rocks that might collide with an island, or even rocks that hinder people's navigation, not necessarily to destroy islands with people on them, but to have a function. It might even be that the shooting part was a lie and it was simply a very large ship for transporting people. And with Uranus, if we assume it's a flying thing because we haven't been told it's the Lulusia thing, I've repeated it 1,000 times. It could simply be for moving faster from place to place, and that's it. And it might not be so much a weapon. But as I say, those things could be used as weapons. The same example I gave you before, the kitchen knife. I can use a kitchen knife to make incredible chicken breasts by cutting them. I can also use the kitchen knife to harm someone, but that knife is not necessarily a weapon, it's simply a kitchen knife. But what happens in One Piece? If that happened, for example, 3,000 years ago or 800 years ago, and those powerful things were used, they would be classified as weapons. Because if you see how someone is capable of manipulating the Sea Kings to cause disasters, you would say it's a weapon, that they are using a weapon, and that person is a weapon. Or I even go further, it may be that these things never happened, and that the people who ruled the world government labeled them as weapons, and that this name was established that they were not called ancient weapons, but simply called that. For example, we have seen that the book Bragmen by Louis Arnault was classified as a fiction book when it is actually a diary that narrated about the giants, and people read that book and think that the giants are fictional, that they are a lie, when really, as I say, it is a diary by Louis Arnault who met those giants. Simply, the government manipulates the information and presents it as it wants, referring to Doflamingo's speech, where he said that those who win have the power, that those who win are the good ones. And that's how everything works. When you win, you are able to say what things are good or bad because you win, and you are also the one who writes history. So if the world government or whoever said those things were weapons, which obviously due to the power they have might seem so, then they would be. Well, that's something similar to what I think about the devil fruits, more or less. So, my opinion on the ancient weapons is that initially, well, they were not weapons. Can they be used that way? Obviously, yes. Anything can be used as a weapon. A piano is used to play music and it's wonderful, but if I throw it at someone's head, well, it will be a... So this is my opinion on the ancient weapons and what they were originally created for. If someone thinks differently and has some arguments from the manga to share with me, leave them in the comments because you know I will read them as always. And let's go to the Wano arc. In the Wano arc, several things happen that are absolutely key to the story. Among them, what stands out the most is obviously all the Gear 5, which has a lot of theories, a lot of future things, past things, and 1,000 things that can be discussed about it. But today we are not going to talk about this. We are going to talk about another topic that goes a bit unnoticed, which is something that indeed causes a big impression the first time you see it, but you think it will be resolved in the same arc in the future. And finally, it doesn't happen. In fact, neither in the same arc nor later, because I am including it in the video for a reason, because this has not been resolved. And at a certain point in the Wano arc, we see that 20 years are mentioned, and this is mentioned by Odin, who says some phrases about how in 20 years, people will come and will be able to liberate Wano. And this is not a phrase that applies only to Odin, but Toki says it too. And the question is, how did they know that in 20 years, Luffy and the others would come to liberate Wano? What way did they have to find out that in those 20 years they would come? How did they know? Where does that information come from? Well, it is something that still has not been resolved and we have no idea. But to try and resolve it, I think we have to analyze the phrases where this is specifically mentioned and analyze all the text. The first thing is the moment Odin says it, and he says, in 20 years, the pirates of the future will arrive in Wano, and when they do, the country must open up. Help them. This is exactly what Odin says, and obviously it's very important because it turns out to be true, but no context is given for why it happens. Now let's move on to Toki, and Toki says, in 20 years, the moonlight will come to dispel the darkness. When the dawn comes, those who have no shadows will disappear. Wano will be the dawn of the world. Again, dawn is mentioned. Again, these 20 years are mentioned, but we have no idea. We have no idea what happens with this, and it is not mentioned. It has been quite difficult for me to reach a solution that could be somewhat logical, because as I said, it is purely speculation. I have been waiting for the Elbaf arc to progress because I thought that maybe something could be revealed here, and despite the fact that a mural has been shown, which is true, that provides us with a lot of information regarding everything we have from the Void Century and everything we have from the ancient world, it is true that nothing about these 20 years is mentioned, even though it seems or could be inferred that this is a cycle. Then, let's see, let's consider the situation. How can it be that Odin has information that in 20 years they will come and liberate Wano? Odin is a person who has spent a lot of his life confined in Wano and then left to travel with Roger and Whitebeard. And in this way discovered the world of One Piece and discovered many islands. That is, any information he might have regarding those 20 years, he probably gathered on the journey with Whitebeard and the journey with Roger. And despite having seen how he went to certain islands and been shown certain scenes, it is true that there is nothing very notable except for two moments. One of them is when he travels with Roger and they arrive in Skypiea and finally engrave the letters on the golden bell that Robin reads years later. And another part obviously is when they reach the island of Laugh-Tale, which is very important and is the most important part of the journey, and in fact, I would say it is one of the most beautiful and best things we have seen in One Piece. Like Skypiea, it seems to be a point that is indeed very old and has a lot of information, but it is quite far from the Blue Sea, so it doesn't seem to me that we can get much information about this, especially if we rely on something from Wano. So it seems quite logical to me to think that it could be something seen on Laugh-Tale, and it may be that we've already seen some hint. Obviously, I'm referring to things we've seen on the journey. For example, if Zunisha at some point knows of the prediction because he knows something from the Void Century, and Zunisha communicated it to Odin and told him, well, we haven't seen that. Perhaps it's something omitted from the journey, which would be very Oda-like, and it's probably what ends up happening. But by applying a bit of the logic of the work of One Piece, it makes a lot of sense that it is something seen in Laugh-Tale, and I will explain why. Something very important that we have seen in the Elbaf arc is the topic of the mural, as I mentioned before. So I think it is quite obvious to see that in this mural, the clearest thing we can perceive is that it seems that everything in some way might be predestined, or that it might be more or less written. We have seen the first world that tells us a story probably prior to those 800 years, the second world that likely tells us of the Void Century, and the third world that tells us something that will happen in the future, more or less understanding that it is like a kind of cycle, that there are patterns that must be more or less repeated, and that everything has a course to follow from day one of the story. So I started thinking and I said, if in Elbaf we have a mural that tells us all this, which is a mural that even the giants don't exactly remember where it comes from, since it very probably comes from the time of the Void Century, or at least that's what I inferred, I think it's quite logical to think that maybe in Laugh, Tale, which is an island that will also be closely related to the Void Century, the Ancient Kingdom, and many things may have, I don't know if a mural, but perhaps some kind of, it says glyph, explanation, book, area, however you want to see it, that tells the same thing in more detail, since it seems that what we saw in Elbaf is just a bunch of scribbles. They simply are not a very simple way of expressing and telling the story. It is something very limited by very simple drawings that seem to be made by a small child, as stated in the manga itself, and it's all very summarized in just 3 texts. So if we assume that when Roger arrived at Laugh Tale he found very important things, it makes a lot of sense that he found this mural there, but explained much more. I don't mean that he obviously found the same mural, but maybe he found a more detailed mural, as I say, a poneglyph, something else, but it explains the information from the mural in much more detail. This is a dangerous topic because obviously when you have the theme of destiny in a work, it can turn out very well or very badly, and it's quite complicated to apply the theme of Luffy's freedom and everything that destiny could be. But well, it's something we will address in a future video. The thing is, we also have to see how Oda's patterns continue, and it's true that in Elbaf he has been giving us information little by little in dribs and drabs, and the mural has been a breath of fresh air because it has told us many new things and has revealed things we didn't even think would be disclosed. But he continues to keep the most important details and hides the essence of the Void Century and the whole topic. So it seems to me that knowing Oda, when we reach the final island, when we reach Laugh Tale, it could be the perfect moment to reveal the detailed story in a much more concise way. This way we could see what Roger saw and understand everything that is happening. And maybe at that moment when we reach Laugh Tale and see the whole story, we might also see things from the journey of the Straw Hats, so they tell us things the Straw Hats have done, even seeing how they themselves are watching themselves finding the island of Laugh Tale, and perhaps refusing to read the end because they still have a bit of adventure left, the final battle to fight, and they don't want to know how it's going to end, which to me personally would seem incredible. So after thinking about it a lot, I think that's the most logical explanation I could come up with. As I say, Oda is a person who hides many things, so throughout the journey he could insert some dialogue we haven't seen. He could have Zunesha talking with Odin or anything, and since we haven't seen it, we have no idea. Oda is very much into these things, but assuming he might have left some clue with the whole 20 years, I think the only way Odin and Toki could know that in 20 years there would be certain people who would liberate Wano is because it was written. I don't think it's anything too crazy unless it's a hack from 3,000 years ago that was able to see the whole history of One Piece, and that it's something more or less similar. So, as I say, I think the most logical explanation is that it was something they saw in Laugh Tale, which is very similar to the mural we've seen in Elbaf, since it seems that the story of One Piece is a kind of cycle, at least with 3 worlds. But anyway, if you have a different idea, leave it in the comments and let's move on to the next mystery. With the second mystery, we have something very interesting and something that relates quite a bit to what I mentioned with the first. In the first, we mentioned that it seems the entire story of One Piece has been written from the start. The 3,000 years, the 800, the first world, the second, and the third, everything seems written, everything seems scripted. And there is a topic in One Piece that is very curious. It is a topic that needs to be analyzed, and it is that we see the theme of destiny mentioned a lot throughout the work. Certain characters mention it in isolated phrases, both more important and less important characters, but it is true that the theme of destiny is discussed. And here it is not so important who says it at certain moments throughout the work because it doesn't seem to be anything very specific, except in the case I'm going to mention, but it is also important to consider who is writing their dialogues, which is none other than Eiichiro Oda, creator of the work One Piece. So if Oda is presenting this concept of destiny multiple times and instilling it in you so that you remember, and doing one of those little plays, those little clues that Oda likes to do, then you have to ask yourself why he is doing this, and why, especially, he included it at the moment I am going to explain now. And there is a moment when Luffy gets his first bounty, and we see people's reactions to Luffy with the first bounty, and they explain a bit about what they think of Luffy at that moment. Then we go to the village where Luffy has lived all his life, and we see that Makino has the poster in her hand. She is looking at the bounty, goes to see the village mayor, and says to him, "Look, Luffy is finally fulfilling his dream." And the mayor says a phrase that I find quite curious, not only because of the person he is, who is still the mayor of the village where Luffy lived, who seems like a person who might have a connection with Shanks or Luffy, because as I said, Shanks went there and obviously has to be someone who might have had a conversation with him, being the most important person in the village. Also obviously has known Luffy and probably talked about Luffy with Shanks. But also what I find more interesting is the panel, and it's what seems quite curious to me. And we see the mayor, who seems to be somewhat angry, somewhat irritated, or somewhat angry because he's squinting his eyes, and in fact, Oda draws veins on his arm to show that he's tense because he's angry. This character has never been known for being very muscular or having pronounced veins, quite the opposite. And here he seems angry. It looks like he's tensing his own muscles and he's upset. And this is when he says the phrase, "Your dream or your destiny." And in the panel, as I said, not only does he appear certainly angry, but he also appears to be drinking, or whatever it is he's drinking. And I find it quite interesting because it seems like a panel that is very focused on him. Notice there's no background, only him and the two dialogues. On the left, we have the destiny, and on the right, we have the dream. I find it quite curious the way the panel is positioned. I know I might seem a bit crazy thinking this, but it seems to me that it is a panel that Oda separates from the rest. In fact, if you look at the whole page, you can tell that part is divided from the rest. It's noticeable that the rest goes one way. This is done so that you see the panel and notice that the bottom part is different. So why does this person, who as I say is certainly important, mention their dream or destiny? As I said, it seems to me that Oda has included the idea of destiny several times. We've seen the mural in Elbaf, we mentioned it in the first theory. I think there are interesting things that can be drawn about the topic of destiny. And Oda, obviously, as I say, has been incorporating it into the work and has been hitting you over the head so you don't forget. But the question here is, how much does this character know? Why does he say this about Luffy specifically? Why does he say that if he is fulfilling his dream, his destiny? Does Shanks know something that we don't? In the recent revelation of the One Piece manga chapter, we have seen that Scopper Gaban tells Shanks something like he was the chosen person, or was the chosen child, or something like that, implying he had a mission to fulfill. Probably it ended up not being Shanks, and it is Luffy. So these people also seem to know things about destiny and such. So from here, I can deduce that Luffy's village mayor might know about destiny because Shanks told him, and maybe Shanks spoke with this mayor and told him, look, he explained the whole story of Roger, told him the entire story he had lived, and said, there is a person who has to free the world, and that person I thought was going to be me. In this case, Shanks. And then he would say that he finally realized that he has inherited the will of his captain. And at that moment, Shanks, in some indirect way, I want to think, gave him the fruit, gave him the Gomu Gomu, which later turns out not to be the Gomu Gomu, but the mythological Hito Hito Mogilonica. And in this way, the mayor found out everything by watching how Luffy slowly grew, became a pirate, and went out to sea. And here it would make sense for Makino to say, Luffy is fulfilling his dream, and for him to doubt if it is his dream, his destiny, and get angry, because he doesn't find it very amusing. Maybe he's not too happy about this. Seeing a person who has grown up since childhood thinking they have a dream, which is to be a pirate, and then realizing that maybe they are somewhat manipulated by Shanks, or that it is their destiny and they are not being free, might be something they don't like. In fact, maybe this is just a kind of reflection of something we will see with Luffy later on. And just think about what Luffy would feel if he found out that his entire dream was never his own. It has always been Shanks' dream, a dream that has been implanted by others. Or that it's something that greatly restricts his freedom. I think it would be an interesting arc if handled well, and I think it could be an important doubt for Luffy, and I think it would make a lot of sense if we see this and analyze other panels about destiny. In any case, I have mentioned it before, it is quite difficult to apply the theme of destiny in One Piece in a way that makes sense, especially because of the theme of freedom with Luffy and everything the work encompasses. but it seems to me that Oda has worked on it a lot from the beginning and must have some idea in his head. We will talk about this in more depth later, especially focusing on what Luffy's fate might be, but I think we need to pay a lot of attention whenever we see the word fate in One Piece. Now let's move on to the third mystery and go with something curious, and it's something that maybe people have forgotten, something people don't consider. And it's that when we start looking at the arcs we have left of One Piece, we can more or less have our things. We can talk about possibly going to Hachinosu, about maybe leaving Elbaf and being able to go to the Sky Islands again from above through what could be Elbaf's tree. This is something that has been discussed a lot. You already know that I think we will go to the moon. It also makes sense that we go to Odd Star, which is supposed to be the last island of the Grand Line, not counting Laugh Tale. Then obviously Laugh Tale as well. Then, obviously, we would have to go to Mary Geoise, maybe an arc about the revolutionaries. There are many places we have to go, and there are many islands. But when talking about this, there's something that is overlooked by 98% of people. In fact, if you know what I'm referring to, leave it in the comments right now. And what is overlooked is something that was mentioned a very long time ago, shortly after the time skip, and it's that as soon as we reunited with the rest of the Straw Hats and went straight into Fishman Island, after the whole adventure, something was left unresolved that seemed like it was going to happen there, but ultimately did not happen. And it's that Madame Charlie, who was a fortune teller completely expert and had been 100% accurate with predictions, predicted in a crystal ball that we would see a person who is supposed to be Luffy. It's true that in the anime you see the face, and in the manga you don't. That detail is important. Very important, but that there would be a person with a straw hat, or at least this silhouette you are seeing on screen, who would destroy Fishman Island. And at first it was implied that it was Luffy. Alright, what's going on with this? What's gonna happen? How is all of this gonna unfold? I have found multiple theories about this because there are many things to discuss. And of course, if we assume at first that it's Luffy, we have to go back to Fishman Island. Luffy cannot destroy Fishman Island from a distance. For now, he hasn't learned how to punch with Wi-Fi yet. Although, well, with the hockey, it's true that he's capable of hitting without touching the target, but I don't think it reaches the Fishman Island. The thing is that, obviously analyzing the panel, we see it and we might think it's Luffy. In fact, it really looks like Luffy because it's a person with a straw hat, and in fact, it seems to have Luffy's silhouette. And as I say, I'm gonna focus on the manga and not the anime. The anime is not canon, and it's not the first time they alter details that end up being contradicted by the manga. So as I say, there are many theories about this. The first of all is that there are people who say it won't be Luffy, and here is something that may sound very crazy, but could make sense. We've seen that there are people like Katarina Devon, who through her fruit is capable of adopting the faces of different people, and among them, she could adopt Luffy's face, could destroy Fishman Island, and in this way blame Luffy. Something I like. It makes sense, but for the moment it's unfeasible because Katarina Devon doesn't have Luffy's face. She hasn't touched Luffy as far as we know, so in principle it's something that is completely ruled out as of today. Another option is Bon Clay, who by the way, if someone doesn't know, is alive, but I don't see him betraying Luffy, although, well, with One Piece you never know. Another option being discussed is that the Fishman Island is indeed destroyed and Luffy goes there to help. And what Madame Charlie saw in the prediction was Luffy next to Fishman Island being destroyed, but he was trying to save it, not destroy it. Although, of course, what she saw in the vision might have affected her a bit, and her first understanding could be that, which obviously makes sense to think. And yet another option is that Luffy finally destroys Fishman Island, most likely not for something bad, but for something good, perhaps because it needs to be destroyed to save everyone, to bring everyone up if it has to be done because the red line must be brought down. The context doesn't matter much. The important thing is to know whether we need to go back there or not. And personally, I think it makes perfect sense for Luffy to destroy Fishman Island. As I said, I don't want to focus on the anime, and I won't even consider it, but it seems to me it would be too serious. Let me explain. I think it would be too serious a mistake to have shown Luffy and not his silhouette if, in the end, it's not going to be Luffy who destroys it. I mean, couldn't it be someone else with a straw hat? Because another theory is that it could be Imu with the straw hat who would destroy Fishman Island, and that's what Madame Charlie saw of someone with the straw hat on their head. Which is fine, and it seems like an interesting idea to me, but I would have to see exactly what the point of this is. Because let's see, as I say, I don't trust the anime, but it would seem like a gigantic mistake to me if you include Luffy, and then, in the end, it's not Luffy if it's something as important as this, because we're not talking about a minor detail. We are talking about the protagonist of the story, the protagonist of your work, destroying one of the most emblematic islands in the world of One Piece. So this is quite important because we are talking about something that would happen many years in the future, and care must be taken to do things right. So I would be very surprised if it is not at least someone with Luffy's appearance. Now what does this imply? There can be several ways for Luffy to destroy Fishman Island, obviously. It may be that, as I say, he destroys it for something positive, but there is also a possibility, and that is we have recently seen in the last chapters of the Elbaf arc that IMU is capable of returning. Bad is capable of controlling and turning anyone into a demon, at least from the outside. Later, when the chapters progress, I want to think that it won't be everyone, but imagine if IMU controls Luffy, Don and Reversi him controls Luffy, and sends him to Fishman Island to destroy it, for whatever reason. In this way, we would have an evil Luffy, an evil Nika, who would be directly destroying the entire Fishman Island, fulfilling Madame Shirley's prediction and perhaps having to fight against Luffy or something like that. But what seems quite logical to me is that at some point the Straw Hats will have to return to Fishman Island. The only problem with this is that I don't know exactly how the plot can develop in the Order of the Islands. To return, I honestly have a very clear idea of how I would do it more simply and quickly, which is through the Sky Islands. I would go up through Elbaf, reach the Sky Islands, where I suppose there is an entrance there, because when we ascended, we were told it was not the usual entrance, but there was another entrance, most likely in Elbaf, I believe. So I would go up through the Sky Islands, and instead of having to navigate all the islands with all the problems of going back, I would go directly through the clouds that might have some much faster means of transport, or we can go more calmly. We go above having a somewhat different trip, and maybe, as I said, faster, quicker. And when we reach the red line, we fall back down and go to Fishman Island. I think it makes a lot of sense. This way we can return to Fishman Island. So the important thing is to keep in mind that indeed we are going to Fishman Island. Something catastrophic is going to happen on Fishman Island. Luffy is going to be there and the Straw Hats too, so we're going to have a little trip back there. Then maybe they'll give us some teleportation fruit with increased range like the one Van Augur has, but 1,000. And they teleport us, and that's it. But I think an arc through the Sky Islands, quick and lasting a couple of episodes to go to Fishman Island again, could be quite interesting. And now, let's solve the 5th mystery of today's video, and let's get straight to the point with Emma's giant hat. But here, the first thing is that I want to tell you something. Let's see, this hat has an incredible Mandela effect. People have in their heads that this hat is gigantic to the point that it could be worn by Dory or Brogy. Well, no, it seems not. In fact, if you look at the image I'm showing on the screen, in the manga you see that it's big, but not that big. I mean, Imu being the size, let's say, of an average person, or a slightly smaller person, the hat is big, but not that big. I mean, Dory and Brogy are very exaggeratedly large, and that hat, I think, would end up being quite small for them. Then, it gives the impression that the hat is big. Very big, but I don't know if I would define it as gigantic. It's true that the term gigantic has become popular in the community, but I think the term very big fits the hat better. Anyway, let's analyze all this and see whose hat this could be. Most people, I know you are thinking right now that obviously it's very easy. This hat belongs to Joy Boy. Well, I think that's not the case, since it is true that we have seen Joy Boy in a flashback and we haven't seen his face, but we've seen him with Emmett. We can compare, and it seems he could be a human. At most, a human a little bit bigger, but I think even the hat, which I've said is not huge, seems too small for him. It doesn't give the impression that Joy Boy was big enough to have that head and that hat. Besides, it would obviously be too easy. We know Oda perfectly well, and we know how much he loves to laugh at us. Don't you think it would be too obvious if it were Joy Boy's hat? That's why I bring you a different alternative, and I think it would make a lot of sense that this hat isn't from Joy Boy, but just a trolling by Oda to make us think it's from Joy Boy. First of all, as I said, is the size of the hat. It seems to be quite large, but not excessively gigantic, so here I am going to throw out something very simple. And I believe that whoever the bearer of this hat is, as of today, we don't know them or we haven't seen them. I'm completely convinced. The idea I'm going to give you, let's see, I have 2 ideas that are more or less similar, but certainly different, and I think it could be someone before Joy Boy. Maybe Joy Boy was a person who had a hat, but not this one. Maybe Joy Boy was someone who came after the hat. And if this hat belongs to the first person who fought 3,000 years ago, or whatever age it was, and if it belongs to that first Nika, who is so believed in by all the giants of Elbaf and even the Buccaneers, who are also certainly larger races, and if Nika was from one of these races but also had a more considerable size, or was certainly large and had this hat, maybe, and if it wasn't Nika and it was a character that, as I say, we still don't know, and that was before Nika, then I think it makes a lot of sense. Why? Well, because as I said, this hat seems to be cryogenically frozen. If it is cryogenically frozen, I understand it is so that the straw does not rot, and because it is kept there in a chamber that probably has, I don't know, other things, bodies or something like that, but it is kept in a cryogenic chamber to preserve it, to keep it. And I think that if this hat is 3,000 years old or more, it would make sense for it to have rotted. So I think it makes sense that it is frozen. Another thing that might come to mind is that this hat doesn't properly belong to anyone, but rather to something. And we know there existed a very advanced kingdom many years ago, known as the Great Kingdom, the Ancient Kingdom, however you want to call it, but we know of its existence. And it's true we haven't seen anything from them, but we know they had great technology and were supposedly advanced people. Then, from this point, I come up with an idea. What if this hat was nothing more than something representative of that country, of that kingdom? And what if perhaps that was something they had, for example, in the center of a table, like they have the Reverie and have their symbol placed in the Reverie of the world government? They had the hat in the center of their Reverie, and it was something that the world government extracted from there. The Ancient Kingdom? What if they copied the Reverie from there because they themselves did the same with other kings and in the center had the straw hat? What did it symbolize, and did they have it there? Does IMU keep the memory of having destroyed that kingdom a long time ago as a sort of trophy, and upon seeing Luffy with it, say that the hat is familiar and reminds him of this ancient kingdom? I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think it would fit that this hat belongs to no one, but to something, or as I say, to many people, as an insignia of that kingdom, and I think it has a lot of logic. This way Oda would surprise us again, because we are always thinking that this hat must belong to someone, whether it is Joy Boy or whoever. But it is true that it's always thought that that person must be someone who wears the hat, when it could be not so, it could be a symbol, and this could make a lot of sense. Well, this is kind of the idea I have right now. I believe that, as I say, there are two variables. The first is that it could be someone we don't know, someone from before Joy Boy, someone who was indeed larger, almost a giant or a very big buccaneer. And that it had, well, years ago, and that this person had the hat, and that, well, I don't know if IMU inherited it or obtained it from that moment or something like that, because IMU is supposed to come from the Void Century, but it could be from before. It's something we can't confirm or deny. But another very important option to consider, as I say, is that it's a symbol. And in this way, IMU would have deceived us all, and Oda would have deceived us all, having that as a trophy of the Ancient Kingdom from so many years ago, and a reminder that they won the war, and that it might be, well, the most prized trophy they have, something like the crown of the Ancient Kingdom, and that they simply have it, well, just as a trophy. I'm going to begin with the origin of the devil fruits. I know that I usually don't touch on these general or widely discussed topics that could have a theory video specifically about them, but I think it's a topic I've been putting off for too long, and I think it's time to talk about it. So let's see what the origin of the devil fruits is. We all know how these fruits work, at least in practice, in a simple way. We know that there is one fruit of each type. We know that there are 3 types of fruits, which are Logia, Zoan, and Paramecia, and that each one grants you special abilities, and that, according to what we have been told, no 2 fruits are the same. That is to say, there is no other fruit like whitebeards, no other fruit like crocodiles, no other fruit like enels. But it is true that there are similar fruits, things we could call superior fruits, twin fruits, or something like that, although they are not really the same, but they are very similar. A very simple example is in Baroque works and also in the Don Quixote family, since, for example, we had Miss Valentine, who had the weight fruit which was able to manipulate her weight but through kilograms. And then in the Don Quixote family, we had a character who was able to do exactly the same. I think his name was Mac Vice, but he did it with tons, being, well, a very similar fruit, but as I said, a bit different. Then we also had Mr. 5, who was able to generate explosions with snot, and we also had a character in the Don Quixote family who was able to generate explosions with what he touched. Another example would be Bon Clay's fruit, which allows you to take on the face of any person you touch. And another would be Katarina Devon's, which is the Zoan of the QB, which we still don't know exactly how it works, but we have seen that you can copy someone's appearance. By the way, they are not the same fruit. Some people think Bon Clay is dead because Katarina Devon has his fruit. Not only is it not Bon Clay's fruit, but it's another one, and Bon Clay is alive, as confirmed by Oda in a manga cover. He is alive and well. I mean, like the video because Bon Clay is alive. But what we're going to do is analyze the origin of these fruits. It's true that a lot has been discussed in the manga about the fruits, not an overwhelming amount, but we have had a decent amount of content regarding the explanation of the fruits. However, it's true that we still haven't managed to find the exact origin. When we've been told about the fruits, there's a lot of mysticism. They're called the devil fruits. It is treated with an aura of magic and a very complicated aura to handle because people do not really understand how these fruits work. And in the world of One Piece, it is certainly something rare. Despite knowing many characters with fruit, we have to remember in the first chapters of East Blue, when they saw a person with a strange ability, the citizens went crazy. That is to say, within the Grand Line, since they are very powerful characters, it is much more likely to encounter a fruit user, so they are much more popularized and well known. Even so, people are still surprised, but this doesn't change the fact that people still don't understand how this works, because obviously they have no idea. It's all, as I say, very mystical. From what we know, it seems that the fruits come from way back. That is, we have seen numerous flashbacks, and there are still people with fruits. It doesn't seem like something that appeared recently. In fact, Vegapunk himself tried to decipher the secrets of the fruits, and still couldn't do it. The most he managed to do was clone one, which is Momonosuke's, and it wasn't exactly a 100% clone of Kaido's because the dragon turned out pink, but he did manage to make it almost perfect, considering that, as he said, the Zoan was the fruit that was somehow the easiest to make. And then the Paramecia and Logia were indeed more difficult for him, even though he was able to introduce part of this fruit into the Seraphim, but that's another topic. What I'm getting at is that Vegapunk was able to replicate a fruit, let's say, at the base, in the most precise way possible, setting aside the issue of color, and even, as I say, he could apply it to other people, even if only partially. More or less, let's say that Vegapunk, who was the most intelligent person in the world, and had knowledge that was ahead of everyone else because of the fruit he had, managed to get very close to replicating the fruits. Moreover, even though he gave the explanation in quotes of the theory that the fruits came from people's dreams, he did not give a very concrete explanation. And it is true that this explanation was a bit disappointing, since in Oda's words he said in an SBS, which is like a Q&A, that there would be a certain very important scientist who would reveal information about the fruits to us later. And we got to Vegapunk and it was not like that. At least at that moment, because later on, it is true that he explained, let's say in a somewhat simple but certainly technical way, how he managed to introduce the fruits into the characters of the Seraphim. And he mentioned that the Zoan was a bit simpler, that he more or less managed to do the Paramecia, but that the Logia was still very difficult for him. Like each fruit had very notable differences within each type, and some were easier to replicate, but others not so much. So, if a person as intelligent as Vegapunk was not able to copy them 100%, we have to understand that this comes from a long time ago, because as he said, there was an ancient kingdom that had technology that even today he could not obtain, which was made by people much more intelligent than him, with many more resources. And this, as I say, is what Vegapunk says. So it's already saying that the ancient kingdom, that famous great kingdom, was very advanced technologically and especially in terms of intelligence, much more than the current world. So everything seems to indicate that they come from that great kingdom. And I want to mention this because there are many people who to this day believe that the fruits are magical, that they come from some magical tree. And I would say that it is practically confirmed that this is not the case. I mean, if Vegapunk is a person who, as he said, was still quite far from the knowledge of these people, and was able to copy a fruit and was able to more or less use those powers in the Seraphim, it means that despite the intelligence gap, if he was able to replicate it in part or replicate it 99%, it is because they are replicable. It's not anything magical, it's something technological, and this is something we've been discussing a lot. We could debate for hours about why the fruits were created. Some people think they are weapons. People like me think they are to preserve resources. Everyone can have an opinion, but I think that today the easiest part to understand is that these fruits are not magical, that they are artificially created fruits. Then it is true that they might have a component where, if they want to go crazy, so to speak, they could include the magical component of having put the god of fire in there, or something like that, which some people mention, but I don't really buy it. But what I'm getting at is that the creation of a fruit is purely technical, purely artificial, probably purely from the Great Kingdom. Why did they do this? Well, this would be for another video, the reason why the devil fruits exist, and you can leave me your opinion about all this in the comments, because you know I'm very interested, not just whether you think they are artificial or not. Honestly, I think it's quite evident that they are artificial, especially because Oda has dedicated part of the Egghead arc to show you this and to replicate fruits. To 99% adding the comedic gag that he couldn't complete the cloning of Momonosuke's fruit because the dragon is pink and not blue. Oh well. So, I don't know, I find it too obvious, at least the part that they are artificial, but the reason why they were created is, as I say, quite debatable. So let me know in the comments why you think the devil fruits were created. So with the first mystery solved, being a very striking and quite simple one, in my opinion, let's move on to the second. The second mystery is something that will definitely stir up a lot of controversy, because let's say the background on this is not good at all, and it's whether aliens exist in One Piece. Some will say, well, what are you saying? How can there be aliens in One Piece? And others will be saying, obviously aliens exist. Here we are going to get straight to the point. It turns out that in Anil's mini-story, if someone doesn't know what a mini-story is, well, basically at the beginning of each chapter, Oda does 3 things on the cover. One is that he doesn't put a cover and instead puts a color spread, which is a large drawing made by him, and they are usually very beautiful. Another is that he does cover requests, meaning I send a letter to Oda and say, draw me a panda eating bamboo on a tricycle while chasing Sanji, who is, tied by the legs while Zoro laughs in the background. And Oda sees it, finds it funny, and draws it. And this is a cover request. And then there's the third option, which are the mini-stories, which use the first cover page of each chapter to tell you a story. Recently, when I'm recording this, we've seen Yamato's mini-story, in which we've seen that he has taken a tour around Wano, done certain things, and there have been 40 chapters of Yamato wandering around Wano. I think it's the worst example I can give you of a mini-story, because this one hasn't been relevant at all, but there is one that was very significant at the time and is still remembered today because we haven't known why this happens. And it's that after Enel's defeat in Skypiea, we see how he finally boards the Ark Maxim and travels to Fairy Verth to the moon. And we see a mini-story of Enel on the moon. We see how some robots go up to the moon, and we have, well, a little adventure of Enel on the moon. What I'm getting at with all this, with the aliens, is that in this mini-story, it seems like there are some space pirates called that. And they even have a Jolly Roger and everything, who are doing things on the moon, like extracting things or something like that. And of course, obviously, you see these beings that are not human at all, that we don't really know what they are and everything, and you say, obviously, these people are aliens. They are simply beings from another world. And this, as I say, was something I had in my head, at least in a very absolute way. I mean, it was something I had very simply, and there was nothing more than they are aliens. There is no other option. But after the Egghead arc, my opinion might vary a bit, and it's that the characters we see on the moon have some kind of gauge, regulator, I don't know how to say it, on their chest, and they have some kind of valve. I don't know exactly what that is. I don't know how to define it. I don't know the technical word, but they have what you are seeing on the screen right now. And this is something that reminds us of certain things we've seen in the Egghead arc. There are certain robots, creatures, jobs, so to speak, that also have this. And this obviously really opens your mind, because let's see, if they are aliens, why do they all have this? Is it something from a suit? Is it something from the clothes they wear? Is it something from the crew? Does it have a story behind it? Let's see a mini story of this group, or are they really creations? Are they creations made by Vegapunk that haven't been revealed because Oda forgot, which is likely? Are they creations that come from the Void Century and that they are still alive out there and are in space doing their things, which I wouldn't rule out either. What exactly are these things? Well, after reviewing the issue of the meters, I start to doubt that they aren't aliens, and that this was precisely Oda's trick, making us think they look like aliens, that you see them and obviously think they are aliens, and that it's simply a distraction. Why? Because if you think about it, that meter they have there in the middle does not. It makes no sense, and that we have seen it replicated in an arc like Egghead, which I remind you has a lot of rockets also on the island, and at the time there was a lot of theorizing about going to space or something like that after Egghead, I among them too. For now it doesn't seem like it will be, although then it did go up to the sky, but not as far as the moon, so it wasn't that crazy. Then another detail is that if we look closely, the Jolly Roger has an elongated skull, quite reminiscent of the character Vegapunk. So, is this something Vegapunk created? Did the previous user of his fruit create it? I don't know, but I think here at the very least we have to seriously consider the option that Oda has deceived us. How many of you who knew this mini story had simply assumed, like, okay, they are aliens and Oda will use them at some point and that's it, because they don't have a very big influence. In fact, Enel humiliates them quite seriously. And then maybe it might not be like that. What if Oda has laughed at us or uses this as something different? What if Oda has used this to make us believe they are aliens when they really are not? And this explains many of the mysteries of One Piece. I mean, what if many of the things we've seen we identify as Thing B when they really are Thing A, and we're simply judging by appearance and rumors do the rest? An example would be the previous point, the devil fruits. As I say, if people start saying that they are devil fruits, that they are from demons, that they possess you, that if you eat another one you die because the demons fight inside you, and all those things are created, you eat a fruit that gives you a firepower, then you are going to relate it to option B, which would be, well, demonic magic or something like that when it is really option A. And there's a phrase right when we're arriving at Jaya where we see a ship falling from the sky. There's a phrase from a person who is an astrophysicist named Willie Kellon who says that anything that can be imagined can become reality. For me, this person created the devil fruits in the Void Century in the Great Kingdom, but that's not the point now. But I want to stick with the phrase that if anything you can imagine is real, what if that imagination of aliens is something we've imagined, but because it exists, like an altered story? I think I'm explaining myself more or less, and I want to make it clear that the thing about aliens, if before I was 99% sure, now it has dropped quite a bit. I think now it's going to be 20% or something like that. I don't rule out that there are aliens in One Piece. It could exist, but I think at least these characters are not. I think we've all been fooled. I think it was simply a trick by Oda, and it worked very well, because in the end, seeing all these things, you say, hey, maybe they're not aliens, maybe they're robots, creatures, suits, something that will be explained later. I hope he explains it at some point, but anyway, I would lower the alien thing to 20%, thinking that there really are going to be aliens, or there could be aliens in One Piece. That said, let's hope they don't appear, like in certain franchises, where an alien shows up at the end just because, and it ruins the plot, right? Let's hope this doesn't happen, because if not, well, it's going to be funny, but not funny like ha ha, funny like I laugh so I don't cry. But as I say, let me know in the comments if you think it sounds like aliens. If not, if there are going to be aliens, leave it all in the comments. And this mystery is truly something surreal because we have talked about it for a long time, we have found explanations, and perhaps the mystery is much simpler than it seems. And it's why Teach can't sleep, why Teach doesn't sleep. When we saw Odin's flashback, we saw Roger and Whitebeard meeting on an island, and we see a scene where Shanks and Buggy are talking about Blackbeard. And we see that they say he is like a monster as he has never slept. And it's curious because in the world of One Piece, it has been mentioned several times that there are people who do not sleep. For example, it is said that in cold countries, people do not sleep. It is said that they are always on alert and do not sleep because of that, precisely because they are on alert for something that might happen to them, whether it be a predator, the cold, anything, and that's why they don't sleep. And it is true that at one point Teach was associated with this, since we actually saw him in Drum in his first appearance, and I myself thought that he would simply be from a cold country and that there wouldn't be more to it. There were even theories, which still exist, that since he has 3 people in his head, or 3 personalities, he switches between them and one is always awake while another sleeps. But I think that seeing what we have recently seen of God Valley, it is much simpler to explain than all this. As I say, when I am recording this, the last chapter that has been published is 1162 of the One Piece manga. That is, Imu has just appeared before Rocks. But with what we have seen, it's more than enough for me to explain and justify everything that happens with Teach. Why doesn't Teach sleep? Well, it's very simple. We have seen that Teach has undergone a trauma. Spectacular. He has seen real atrocities, and being a child, how old would Teach be there? 1, 2, 3 years old. He was a child, but you can see him. Oda has made sure you see panels of the manga where you see him horrified. You see him hyper surprised, scared, with fear in his mother's arms, a mother who will likely die by the end of the arc. His father died or disappeared too. I say disappeared because, who knows, I don't trust anything anymore. All the people from his clan were annihilated. He lived a nightmare. In fact, when Whitebeard finds him, he finds him crying, lying down, alone. In fact, Oda drew Teach as a child and put this panel you see here with the moon, him alone, lying down and suffering. Since he was a child, he has had a terrible time. So it makes sense that he doesn't sleep. How are you going to sleep if every time you close your eyes, you see the image of your father being destroyed in God Valley? If you see explosions, deaths, blood, your family members dying, your mother carrying you in her arms, falling while she is handcuffed because there are the Tenryubito attacking her. In fact, Oda made sure to show us a panel that depicted the perspective of Teach and the Tenryubito, and they are real monsters. It's terrible. And then on the island, there are powers, dragons, explosions, clashes of power, the devil himself, the world. It's all there. There's a fight happening that a child shouldn't have to see, especially when the child is the one being chased. Look at the case of Shanks. The case of Shanks is different. They fell asleep. They didn't notice. They didn't really know what was happening. They were protected by dragon. When they were attacked by that divine knight, Shanks hit his head and fainted. So the perspective of each is very different. Oda also made sure to give us a panel where we saw Aris with Teach on the left and Dragon with Shanks on the right, as if clearly distinguishing one from the other. So I think the simplest explanation for why Teach doesn't sleep is simply due to trauma, and I think it would be very interesting. I think the fact that Oda has presented us with that doubt as a super complicated mystery and that we rack our brains over it, and it really being just a simple nod to his childhood, to the traumas he has, to how Teach is, to how badly he has had it and everything seems like a stroke of genius to me, honestly. It seems like a way to laugh at people, as if saying, come on, now you're gonna spend 3 or 4 years thinking up crazy theories, and it's going to be the simplest thing in the world, and it will help reinforce the character, because this thing about not sleeping, this trauma, will help us understand the character when it comes out, is explained, and is shown on camera, revealing all the information we want to know about the character. Because Oda has been building this character little by little with very subtle details, and this is one of them. Do you think the phrase "dreams never end" is a random phrase? Obviously not. This phrase will become important at some point. Who knows if these were Rox's last words, or if it's a phrase that becomes relevant at some specific moment. This entire character is much better thought out than we believe, and this phrase, which as I say could be due to 1,000 things, seems to be just a trauma, and it's perfect, it's justified. It doesn't need to overthink the matter, go here and there and do a triple somersault. No, it simply needs to show you a child experiencing a trauma and how they are living through it, and I think it's great because it greatly enhances the character. So I think this mystery is the one with the least explanation. I think it's the easiest to solve because Oda has already shown it to us clearly, and I think it's quite evident. I know there were quite a few people who didn't even remember this phrase or this, and now you're going to see it and say, hey, well, he's right. And to me, what Oda has done seems genius, truly. This seems like a genius move. Maybe it's just me, as I sometimes tend to overrate certain things about Oda and sometimes underrate others, I guess, like everyone, but I really love this. Let's analyze each of the Straw Hats, one by one, who are currently part of the crew. I say this because it's possible that by the end of One Piece, someone extra might be included, like Loki, Yamato, or perhaps another new character we don't know. And let's start directly with Tony Chopper, the crew's doctor. We begin with Chopper, our adorable human reindeer and doctor, although a bit useless. Currently, Chopper has the ability of the Ito fruit, which is the devil fruit that makes you human, allowing him to change shape, especially thanks to his rumble ball, and he has developed various points, forms, however you want to call them, that grant him different attributes. He has the brain point for thinking, the heavy point for brute strength, the guard point for defense, and his most powerful form, the monster point, where he becomes a giant monster with enormous strength. Before, he used to lose control in Monster Point, but after the time skip, he managed to master it much better. Now he can even talk and reason in that form. In Wano, we already saw that Chopper greatly improved his Rumble Ball with the help of Caesar Clown to extend the duration of the Monster Point to 30 minutes, although at the cost of becoming exhausted and turning into a tiny elderly Chopper afterward. This monster point is so strong that it allowed him to withstand some blows from none other than Queen, one of Kaido's commanders, all during the Battle of Onigashima. I must say, that's not bad at all for Chopper, especially for being a doctor. How did Chopper get these powers? Well, his journey to become strong has been mainly through science with the Rumble Balls and medical training. He himself invented the Rumble Balls after joining the crew under the tutelage of Dr. Kureha to modify the limits of his fruit. During the time skip, he studied on Torino Island and perfected his forms, so now he can transform into almost all his points without using Rumble Ball, except for the Monster Point. His great achievement post-time skip was precisely mastering that monster point enough to use it deliberately and not just as a last resort. Now, in terms of hockey, Chopper has not yet shown any of the 3 variants, and this is understandable. Chopper is a reindeer who gained human intelligence with his fruit and has focused much more on medicine than on being a hockey warrior. However, many of us think it's time for him to get a hockey power-up. Learning even armament hockey would be a huge leap for him, as it could enhance his physical blows several times beyond what he is currently capable of achieving. Imagine Chopper hardening his enormous monster point fists with armament hockey. It would be terrifying for his enemies, but unfortunately the narrative reality is that Chopper is not a combat-oriented character. He is the group's doctor, and Oda usually keeps him in that support role, besides using him for comic relief and selling plush toys. And it wouldn't be surprising if we don't see significant power improvements in Chopper, perhaps even until, as I say, the very end of the story. Let's remember that even in his bounty, he's always treated more like a pet than a serious threat. 50 berries, then 100, now 1,000 berries. A joke that will probably continue. In other words, by the logic of the story, Oda might not give Chopper a massive power boost because his main role is to heal the crew and provide cuteness and humor. Is there anything else Chopper can evolve in? If we speculate a bit, yes. His monster point could already be considered an almost awakened form of his fruit, but it would be great if at the end of the series, Chopper achieves a true awakening, meaning he can enter monster point at will, without needing rumble balls and without side effects, that he is able to maintain that monstrous form for a prolonged time and control it completely. And that would be the ultimate power-up for him. Imagine Chopper fighting in his giant form alongside the others, but without limitations. He would be at the level of a giant in terms of physical presence. Another potential theoretical improvement would be that, in addition to armament hockey, he awakens observation hockey, especially to better detect the vitality of allies and enemies, something that, as a doctor, would make a lot of sense. In summary, Chopper probably won't become extremely powerful in combat, as we will see with the rest of the Straw Hats. And his most logical improvement would be to perfect what he already has, which would be the monster point, and perhaps, at most, add a basic hockey. At the end of the day, he will end up being, as always, the adorable reindeer doctor, only he would be able to give you a punch the size of a building if the situation calls for it. Now let's continue with Nami, navigator of the Straw Hats, known as the Cat Burglar. Nami was always considered part of the weak trio of the crew compared to the combat monsters, but things have changed quite a bit recently. Her most notable power-up so far has been becoming a companion of Zeus, a homie cloud from Big Mom's soul, who now lives inside her Klimatact. Thanks to Zeus, Nami gained a huge increase in offensive power. Now she can summon lightning and storms with much more strength than before, to the point of seriously electrocuting very strong enemies. For example, with Zeus's help, she managed to defeat Ulti, one of the Tobirapo, and she did this with a single thunderous electric attack. As for how she got Zeus, it was a matter of luck and cunning. During the Battle of Wano, Big Mom lost control over Zeus, and he ended up taking refuge in Nami's Klimatact. Nami, being clever, showed affection to Zeus and convinced him to stay with her. I would also be convinced to stay with her if she showed me a little affection, and if not too. Since then, Zeus is literally Nami's living weather weapon. Before Zeus, Nami had already been improving her weapon a lot. Let's remember the Klimatact created by Usopp in Alabasta, which was later improved in Scipioea, becoming the perfect Klimatact with dials, and later modified with the weather science that Nami learned in Weatheria during the prize. It even received another upgrade from Usopp later. All these versions allowed Nami to recreate weather effects, generate clouds, heat bubbles, gusts of wind, mirages with temperature changes, etc. Basically, Nami already does things typical of a weather fruit, but using tools. That's why many of us doubt that she will eat any devil fruit, and it's because, well, she doesn't need it. Her weapon achieves similar effects. Also, giving Nami a fruit would mean taking away her ability to swim. And being a navigator, that might be more of a problem than a benefit. In terms of hockey, Nami has not shown to use it either. And let's be honest, it doesn't seem very likely that Nami will awaken Armament Hockey or the King's Hockey, as they don't fit her style. Could she learn Observation Hockey? Maybe a little. As a navigator, Nami has a sixth sense for weather changes. It's not Haki per se, but it shows sensitivity to her surroundings. If she developed observation Haki, it could help her dodge attacks or launch hers with greater accuracy at long range. It wouldn't be far-fetched. Usopp unlocked that Haki in Dressrosa so Nami could follow that path. Still, it's not certain or vital for her. Now, how far could Nami go with new upgrades? The most interesting aspect points to her Klimatact. It is already very powerful with Zeus inhabiting it, but it could become even better. Let's think about the context of the previous arc. Egghead, Vegapunk, the greatest scientist in the world who was there and is currently in Elbaf through Lilith. These climatic inventions sound like something that might be in his area of expertise. What if Vegapunk / Lilith decides to upgrade Nami's Klimatact? The idea is not far-fetched. In fact, many fans, myself included, believe that Nami could leave Elbaf or the following arcs with a Klimatact that is technologically super enhanced. This is just a theory for now, obviously not confirmed in the manga, but it would be the perfect power-up for Nami given that she excels at using those tools. Imagine Lilith incorporating special materials or adjustments that amplify Zeus's lightning or give access to much more extreme weather phenomena, portable tornadoes, sudden pressure changes, and with Lilith Vegapunk as an ally, the possibilities are enormous. As for the story's logic, Nami probably wouldn't seek to be a super fighter beyond what's necessary. Her main motivation has never been to be strong in a fight, but to fulfill her dreams, drawing that map of the world. She herself has always preferred to avoid having high bounties or attracting the attention of the world government, so even though she has become more capable in battle, and Zeus has indeed made her dangerous, Nami is not going to become part of the monster trio or anything like that. She will remain in a middle range where her intellect, cunning, and now her weather magic will allow her to defeat enemies when the conditions are right, but we won't see her, for example, exchanging punches with an admiral. In summary, her power ceiling is being an increasingly ingenious weather mage, but not becoming a brutally aggressive warrior, and that's fine, because Nami shines by using her head and the weather to her advantage. Now let's move on to Brook, the skeletal musician and swordsman of the crew, artistically known as Soul King. Brook is peculiar in himself. He died decades ago, but his Yomi Yomi no Mi, the Revive fruit, gave him a second life, bringing his soul back to the world of the living. Currently, Brook's greatest power comes precisely from this fruit and how he has developed it. What can Brook do? He can do everything a good swordsman and musician would do, but while being dead, and he is extremely agile and light, as he is basically just bones. He wields his sword skillfully and combines his music with combat. The most special aspect of his soul power is that Brook can separate his soul from his own body, projecting himself as a spirit to explore or also to attack. He has also shown a certain affinity with the spirit world and the cold of the afterlife. His sword attacks sometimes freeze the enemy as if bringing them from the cold of death. In fact, his sword is called Soul Solid and can produce ice. Brook was even able to face homies, objects with souls of Big Mom and Whole Cake, all thanks to his own soul being able to counter Big Mom's influence. As for Haki, Brook has not manifested any type yet, given that he is a comedic and secondary support character in fights. Oda has not had him use Haki so far, but he could learn it. Well, possibly yes. Brook could awaken observation Haki in the future. This would be useful for better supporting his companions, detecting enemies not directly visible, which would be helpful when he projects his soul far away, for example. A Brook with observation Haki could be a fantastic sentinel for the crew, detecting all hidden presences. An armament Haki, well, it would also be useful for him to have it to fight certain Logias, or very resistant enemies. But if I had to bet, observation fits a bit more with his support role and his personality, as he is funny and perceptive. Imagine him saying, "I have observation Haki, but I don't have eyes. Yo ho ho ho." Now let's talk about something very interesting, the possible awakening of Brook's fruit. His Yomi Yomi no Mi is unique. It already allowed him to return from death once and manage his soul in very creative ways. So what else can he do if he awakens it? Well, here we enter theoretical territory. Some fans speculate that if Brook awakens his fruit, he could influence other souls, not just his own. Does it sound a bit strange and a bit dark? Well, a little, but imagine if Brook could, for example, temporarily separate an enemy's soul from their body. It would be a devastating effect, basically knocking someone out by taking their soul, even if just for a moment. Another extreme possibility is that Brook could absorb or consume the souls of others to empower himself or even learn techniques from them. This last part is highly speculative and perhaps too dark for the tone of One Piece, but the idea arises from the fact that an awakening of a paramecia usually extends the power to others or the environment. Brook, in theory, could project his life energy into the world around him. It has also been joked that if he gave another massive concert as Soul King, with that power he could give his entire audience an out-of-body experience, literally. And it sounds funny, but also a bit weird. Brook has already fulfilled a good part of his dream. He became famous again as a musician and hopes to reunite with Laboon. As for the fight, he has had his heroic moments, like stealing a poneglyph right under Big Mom's nose or helping Robin against Black Maria. But he is not part of the core of the strongest fighters. It is unlikely that Oda will turn him into a fighting machine on the level of Zoro or Sanji, but such a groundbreaking awakening might not happen, but if it does, it will probably be used in a comedic or specific way. In summary, Brook's ceiling will probably be learning some observation haki, mainly to complement his kit and continue taking advantage of his undead nature in clever ways. His soul ability is already quite useful for espionage and mischief. Let's remember how in Whole Cake Island he went through closed doors and scared enemies by appearing as a ghost. And in combat, as long as he can freeze opponents and deliver good sword strikes, he will fulfill his role. Brook will continue to be that rock star invincible to the passage of time, literally because he is already dead. We now continue with Franky, the super cyborg and right-hand man in the crew's engineering. Franky is already quite strong as he is. During the Wano arc, we saw him defeat Sasaki on his own, one of the Tobi Rappo who were part of the elite. He achieved this by combining the power of his mecha, Franky Shogun, the giant robot he built, with his own modified body and arsenal of weapons. Currently, Franky does not have any known fruit or haki powers. His power lies in his technology and brute strength. After the time skip, Franky rebuilt himself with resources from Vegapunk's old laboratory in Baldivia, equipping himself with things like the Radical Beam, a laser inspired by the pacifists, and many new weapons. His body runs on cola as fuel, which is peculiar but effective. Basically, Franky is a walking arsenal. He has cannons, lasers, interchangeable arms, vehicles. How did Franky get his upgrades? Well, unlike others, he builds them himself. Franky has progressively modified himself from a common human who became a cyborg after the accident in Water 7, and then during the time skip he became even more mechanical, so much so that his face is now a metal plate, for example. He also designed and built the Thousand Sunny ship with wood from the legendary Atom Tree, showcasing his talent as an engineer carpenter. Every time Franky finds new technology, he incorporates it. An example was that after reading Vegapunk's documents, he implemented the laser in his body, so we could say that Franky's continuous power-up is his engineering, and he can always add more resistant materials or more powerful weapons to his body. But then, what could be next for Franky? This is where the possibilities get a little exciting, and it's similar to Nami's case. Having left Egghead, but with Lilith as the Vegapunk in Elbaf, it's quite hopeful to think that Franky could leave Elbaf with a significant upgrade. Lilith Vegapunk is literally the scientist whose inventions Franky has revered for years, and it's the golden opportunity to learn new tricks, as he couldn't do this in Egghead due to the situation. So he could get, for example, new types of laser weaponry, upgrades to his suit, or even to the Sunny. There is a theory that perhaps Vegapunk could help him redesign his body, maybe making it a bit more efficient or compact without losing power. Can you imagine Franky returning to a perhaps more human design, but with the same current strength thanks to Vegapunk's futuristic science? Let's see, it would be interesting, although there are many people who already like Franky's current form, but seeing that they changed Robin's hairstyle to resemble the pre-time skip one, maybe it could be there. Another quite obvious area for improvement is the haki. Franky has not used haki so far, but since he fights hand to hand, armament haki would be perfect for him. It would be great to see him harden his metal fists with haki to enhance his punches like the strong right, or make his Franky Shogun robot even more resistant. A cyborg covered in black haki armor sounds great and would fit well with Franky's tough style. The question is whether he will have the time or need to learn it in the middle of the final plot, and it could be that perhaps in the final war Franky ends up using haki in some way, but Franky's narrative ace up his sleeve is Pluton. Let's remember that in Go Event, it was revealed that Franky possessed the blueprints of the ancient weapon Pluton, a legendary warship. Franky decided to burn these blueprints so they wouldn't fall into the wrong hands, but that connection with Pluton could tie him to future events. We know that the real Pluton is hidden in Wat, and many fans speculate that later on Franky could build a new Pluton, but using the Thousand Sunny as a base. Or even discover Pluton himself and pilot it. What would this mean in terms of power? Having an ancient weapon under control is a game changer. Pluton is supposedly a battleship capable of devastating entire islands. If Franky manages to command such a machine, the crew would gain a gigantic military advantage. Of course, this depends a bit on how Oda is going to handle the ancient weapons, but the possibility is there. In terms of power up, it's not that Franky becomes physically stronger, but he would have the most powerful weapon of the seas at his disposal, greatly increasing not only the narrative danger, but also the influence, taking it to another level. Now regarding limits, perhaps a bit more terrestrial, a bit more logical. No. Franky is a curious case because technically he doesn't have a clear ceiling other than what the available technology imposes. He can always find a harder alloy, a more powerful fuel, or a bigger weapon. However, within the story, Oda will probably keep him a step below the true monster fighters. Franky usually tends to face opponents of a high intermediate level, like a Tobirapo, as we saw earlier, or a Vice Admiral, but I doubt we will see him defeat an Admiral, or of course a Yonkou one-on-one. For example, his role is to be the heavy fire support and construction, not the protagonist of the most epic battles. Additionally, Oda balances the crew quite well, as the monstrous trio Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji have more exaggerated powers, while Franky compensates with ingenuity. In conclusion, Franky's ceiling will be somewhat marked by his ability to invent. It is possible that we will see him with new equipment made by Vegapunk, perhaps using ultra-resistant materials or advanced science weapons. Maybe he will integrate new technology from the Seraphim, or perhaps he can incorporate a system based on the discoveries Vegapunk made in Egghead, an energy shield, anti-gravity boots. Who knows? But well, if he learns Haki, it would be the icing on the cake to complement him. And in a distant horizon, if the Pluton plot is activated, then Franky could become the man behind the greatest weapon in history, solidifying him as a legend among the engineers of the sea. Very, very cool for Franky. I like it. We arrive at Usopp, the shooter and professional liar of the team, who is ironically called God Usopp since Dressrosa. Usopp is a special case because unlike many of his companions, his strength does not lie in brute force or supernatural powers, but in his ingenuity, marksmanship, and incredible luck. Currently, Usopp fights using his giant slingshot, the Kuro Kabuto, and a variety of pop greens, which are seeds of exotic plants he developed during his training on Boeing Island. These seeds, when thrown, quickly grow into plants with offensive or utilitarian effects. Vines that trap, exploding bamboos, giant flowers. Usopp also retains tricks like the smoke star, the spicy chili star, and other very creative ammunition. His aim is exceptional. Let's remember that he was able to shoot Sugar in Dressrosa from hundreds of meters away and without a direct line of sight, something he managed to awaken at that moment thanks to observation Haki, which ironically he hasn't used in a very notable way on screen after that miraculous shot. He perceived the aura of Luffy, Law, and Sugar, and with that, he was able to calculate his shot despite the obstacles. This was a great moment and an increase in his abilities. But how did Usopp get that power up? Well, under extreme pressure, his friends were about to be turned into toys, and he overcame his cowardice for a second to save them, awakening the Haki. It was more of a sudden burst than conscious mastery. Since then, Oda has kept Usopp in his typical scared personality, so we haven't seen him train or make much use of that Haki. Usopp also improved somewhat in physical endurance during the time skip, but he still has a relatively normal build. Why doesn't Usopp become stronger quickly? Well, because of the narrative. Usopp is the normal man of the group in many ways. Fearful, sometimes weak-willed, very human. His dream is to become a brave warrior of the sea, which implies that he is not yet. If suddenly Usopp overcame all his fears and became completely brave and powerful, his character arc would be complete at that moment. Oda wants Usopp to remain the same, the clever coward, until the climactic moment of his development. That's why, no matter what he achieves, like in Dressrosa where he was a hero, he always shows fear again afterward. Keeping him at that earthly level makes his eventual moment of ultimate bravery much more emotional, so Oda deliberately doesn't give Usopp big power-ups in the traditional sense. We will not see Usopp suddenly with superhuman strength or devastating martial techniques, because it would break the purpose of his own character. So what potential for evolution does Usopp have from here to the end? There are some interesting ideas, and curiously many come from the lies that Usopp has told. In One Piece, Usopp's lies sometimes come true in an ironic way. He said he saw a giant fish, that his droppings were like islands, and then he saw it when leaving Little Garden. He said he encountered a village of dwarves and later found the Tontada. He said he fought with a giant mole and fought with Miss Merry Christmas in Alabasta, and like these, many more. But among his most recent lies are that he possesses Conqueror's Haki and that he will command an army of 8,000 people. It sounds very far-fetched, but what if it turns out to be true in the end? The idea of Usopp awakening the Conqueror's Haki is probably the most speculative of all, but there are those who support it. The Conqueror's Haki, let's remember, is that rare power that only those with overwhelming will have. Usopp, at first glance, doesn't fit. He trembles with fear constantly. How could someone so cowardly have the King's Haki? Well, those who support this theory point out that Usopp, deep down, has a very strong will when it matters. We saw him face Luffy himself in Water 7 for his own convictions, or risk his life in East Blue to save Robin. Additionally, his lie about having the Conqueror's Haki could be Oda playing with the idea that eventually, in a moment of great courage, Usopp might actually manifest it. It would be ironic and epic. The boy who always runs away ends up literally knocking out enemies with his spirit. This is perhaps more of a fan fantasy, but I can't help but mention it because it's part of the conversation that is most on the table about his potential. A more viable evolution is for Usopp to fully develop his observation Haki. He has already taken the first step, so he could learn to use it at will. Let's imagine Usopp in Elbaf as he is currently. Here, he could further train his aim. Perhaps Shanks could return with Usopp's father, Yasopp, who is one of the best snipers in the world, and maybe he could learn legendary shooting techniques and combine that with advanced observation Haki. There might be a moment in the future to make the perfect shot. This does sound possible and useful, especially considering the final battle. And Usopp has to learn to take down crucial things with a single long-distance shot. Also, let's not forget the army of 8,000 men I mentioned. Currently, Usopp is quite popular. The dwarves of Dressrosa adore him like a god. He has giant friends, and it wouldn't be strange if by the end of Elbaf, Usopp wins over the giants with some feat or story and ends up leading a battalion of giant warriors in the final war. This would fulfill his lie about the 8,000, since one giant would be worth many men, meaning that perhaps with 800 giants, it would be like 8,000 men. And it would be a moment of redemption for him, standing in front of an imposing army, truly being the great sea warrior Usopp, the one he always wanted to be. In terms of power, commanding an army is more of a tactical achievement than a personal one, but it would undoubtedly make Usopp feared worldwide, as he himself fantasized. In short, Usopp is not going to have a sudden power-up, like now he will launch a Kamehameha. His improvements would be gradual and narrative in nature, perfecting his shot and his observation Haki, perhaps obtaining better ammunition, and eventually demonstrating genuine bravery that impresses everyone. Perhaps the climax of his development is just a heroic act where he deceives the enemy or inspires his allies in a brilliant way. And who knows, at that point, at his peak, we might even see a hint of Conqueror's Haki emanating from Usopp if it serves the story, as a metaphor that he has finally become that brave person he always wanted to be. But until he gets there, Usopp will stay true to his style, a coward with a lot of luck, creativity, and a very brave hidden heart that beats stronger when his friends need him. Let's continue with Nico Robin, the archaeologist of the crew, also called the Devil Child by the government. Robin is not known for overwhelming physical strength, but for the unique power of her fruit, Hahana, the flower fruit, which allows her to sprout parts of her body on any surface. Currently, Robin can literally create hundreds of limbs at a T-Oau, which she used impressively in Dressrosa, making a giant hand to hold Hakuba, and especially in Wano, where she obtained a long-awaited power-up, the Demonio Fluer. But what is the Demonio Fluer? It is a new technique or form that Robin revealed in her fight against Black Maria. It consists of Robin making a giant duplicate of herself bloom, but with a demonic appearance. Dark skin, horns, demon wings. She truly lived up to her nickname of the Demon Child in this form. Additionally, Robin greatly multiplies her size and strength and was able to defeat Black Maria with a devastating final blow, the giant hand Spang. This was her first major one-on-one victory since practically Skypiea many years ago, so we all celebrated it. But how did Robin get this power-up? It seems to be the result of her training during the time skip with the Revolutionary Army and her own ingenuity. Robin mentioned that Sabo and Koala taught her certain things. From Koala, she learned basic fishman karate, which is why she was able to use a water palm attack to extinguish the flames in Onigashima, and from Sabo, possibly, concepts of hand-to-hand combat. They also called her a demon, symbolically, which perhaps inspired the visual form of the Demonio Flower. When Robin found herself cornered by Black Maria, she decided to play that hidden card we hadn't seen. It's likely she had already developed it off-screen and was just waiting for the right moment to use it. It is not a formal awakening of her fruit, but rather an evolution of her techniques, using the same power as always, but on a larger scale. Speaking of awakening, Robin's Hana-Hana fruit is already quite unusual. Normally, a Paramecia user can only affect their own body, but Robin can make her parts appear on other people and objects, also interacting with the environment at a distance. And this is something typically only seen in awakened fruits. That is why some say that Robin's power is almost awakened from the start, and that Oda designed her that way, and that we will not see an additional classic awakening. In other words, the Demonio Flower could be the maximum her fruit reaches in terms of manifestations, without adding new abilities of magical origin. However, you never know. An awakening of the Hana-Hana no Mi, if it existed, might allow Robin to create complete clones of herself, instead of just a giant half-body, or make parts sprout from other people. Can you imagine making arms sprout from the enemy's own body to immobilize them? Very crazy, but interesting. Where Robin clearly has room for improvement is in Haki. Robin has not used Haki so far in the story. However, as the enemies become stronger, many with Haki or Logia fruits, not very powerful Paramecias, she could greatly benefit from learning even Armament Haki. Let's imagine that Robin could cover those hundreds of arms she can sprout with Armament Haki. Her traditional clutch techniques, the bone-breaking ones, would be devastating, even against very resistant opponents, because the hardened arms would have much more strength and could even harm Logia users. Picture the scene. Robin smiling as a swarm of black hands appears, slapping some unfortunate soul. It would be very epic. For us, for him, it would be terrifying. Moreover, Robin's fighting style, which does not require brute strength but strategic placement of her limbs, would be perfectly complemented by Haki. In my opinion, it is almost certain that Robin will learn at least a bit of Haki before the end, maybe during the Elba arc itself, and even observation Haki would also be useful to anticipate attacks when she multiplies. But if I have to choose, Armament Haki would give her more offensive advantage. But how strong could Robin become? Since she is not one of the main fighters, don't expect her to reach Yonkou commander levels or anything like that. Her importance lies in knowledge, in reading the poneglyphs, but Oda has already shown us that he wants her to be able to defend herself. The Demon Flower was that step, so Robin's ceiling in terms of power could be a Robin with the Demon Flower plus Armament Haki. With this, she could face mid-high level enemies with some confidence. I don't imagine her, for example, defeating an Admiral one-on-one, but she could handle opponents of the caliber of the Tobirapo type or lower commanders. Narratively, moreover, Robin will always have others protecting her from great dangers. Being the only one who can decipher the path to Laugh-Tale, she is a priority target. For that reason, it makes sense for her to increase her strength a bit so as not to be completely a damsel in distress. In conclusion, Robin already made a necessary leap in Wano by showing us what she is capable of. Her greatest improvement would probably be mastering Haki, especially Armament Haki, to enhance her existing techniques. I wouldn't expect another mode, another transformation beyond the Demon Flower. Maybe she will perfect it by making it last longer or move freely. Perhaps we will see variants like a complete Demon Flower, a giant full body one using its demonic wings to glide in the air, or things like that. And those would be logical evolutions of what she has already shown. But beyond that, his role in the story does not require him to be a beast in fighting, only to be able to survive and fulfill his mission of reading the poneglyphs. And with the Demon Flower and a possible Haki, he could surely do it, even if he faces some CP0 agent or another bounty hunter along the way. Now it's Jinbe's turn, the helmsman and former pirate captain who officially joined after Whole Cake and during the Wano arc. An interesting character because, unlike many of the previous ones, he started in the crew already being very powerful. Jinbei was in the elite of the pirates from before. He has impressive strength and technique in hand-to-hand combat, especially his fishman style, with which he can manipulate water, even the water in the opponent's body, mainly to launch long-distance attacks. He also masters fishman jujutsu, which is more useful underwater. And indeed, Jinbei is virtually invincible in the water, being a fishman. Add to that all his experience. He fought side by side with Ace for days, faced admirals, blocked attacks from Akainu and Aokiji in Marineford to protect Luffy, and more recently, defeated Who's Who with relative ease. Jinbei possesses armament haki, as we saw him harden to block attacks. For example, he successfully stopped an attack from Big Mom and Whole Cake alongside Robin and the others. He should also have observation haki, although there hasn't been an obvious scene, but like every veteran warrior, it is almost certain that he possesses it to a basic degree. What he hasn't shown is Conqueror's haki, at least not until now. Let's talk about the possible improvements for Jinbei. Honestly, Jinbei doesn't need a clear power-up right now. What he needs are opportunities to shine. In Onigashima, he had his duel with Who's Who and dispatched him, showing a good combo of karate and strong punches. But being new to the crew, we haven't seen all his potential yet. Is there something Jinbei could develop further? Maybe Conqueror's haki? It is not certain that he has it, but there are details that make us think he might have it. First, Jinbei has a strong will and is a natural leader, as he was the captain of the Sun Pirates, and we even saw him exercise some leadership in the Marineford War. When Big Mom tried to intimidate him by taking his life, that soul roulette, Jinbei stood firm without fear, demonstrating an indomitable spirit. That scene practically screamed Conqueror's haki, at least in terms of attitude. Although there wasn't an actual burst of haki, it wouldn't be surprising if Jinbei turned out to be a Conqueror's haki user, and Oda reveals it in a future crucial battle. If so, Jinbei would join Luffy's club within the crew in having that rarity. It would be a narrative power-up, as it would confirm that Jinbei is of that legendary character mold, but in practice, it wouldn't drastically change how he fights unless he learns to infuse that haki into attacks, something reserved for very few. Another possible but likely power-up is a devil fruit. However, this is almost dismissible. Fishmen rarely eat fruits, as they would lose their greatest natural advantage, which is being able to swim freely. Jinbei especially loves the sea, and his style depends on being in contact with water, so I don't see him sacrificing that for a fruit power. He is already very strong without needing any magical extra. So what is Jinbei's ceiling? I would say that Jinbei is already at his ceiling or close to it. He is currently a combatant at the level of a Yonkou commander, perhaps comparable in strength to a Jack, or even to Queen in certain scenarios. By the end of the series, Jinbei probably won't increase his brute strength much more. Rather, we will see him go all out against very high-level opponents. Consider that in the final saga, Jinbei could face an admiral or some big shot from the Navy or the government. There he would unleash all his karate, his armament haki to the fullest, which he already has, but we haven't seen it at its limit, and perhaps, as we've mentioned, if he comes to possess Conqueror's haki, he might use it to dominate lesser soldiers on the battlefield. Narratively, Jinbei is older and wiser. His role is often to advise Luffy or calm things down. He is not a character on an upward trajectory like the younger ones, but one already established. That's why I don't expect huge surprises in terms of new power for him, but rather the satisfaction of seeing him fight without reservations with what he already has. Even so, if Oda wanted to give him a little boost, he could give us that confirmation of Conqueror's haki in him, which would fit well with his nickname of Knight of the Sea, an imposing knight worthy of kings. It's also possible that we might see some supreme technique of Fishman karate that Jinbei hasn't used yet. In summary, Jinbei is already a tank within the crew. His evolution would be more demonstrative than transformative. We will see him stand alongside the greats without the need for crazy transformations, and if some new haki is confirmed in him, that would be great, but he doesn't need it to be relevant. Jinbei is proof that a character already introduced in their maturity can contribute to the final story by providing experience, absolute loyalty to Luffy, and reliable strength when needed. So while Jinbei doesn't have a very obvious power-up pending, like Nami or Frankie did, let's not underestimate him, because in the end, when we see the Knight of the Sea fighting seriously, we'll understand why even Ace and other characters respected him so much. Now we move on to the third monster of the crew, Sanji, our cook with a seductive humor and fiery kicks. Sanji has always been part of the main trio of fighters alongside Luffy and Zoro, and in Wano he reached new levels of power thanks to certain family revelations or his current situation. Sanji uses the black leg combat style, meaning kicks and foot techniques without using his hands, because they are for cooking of course. He was already capable of incredible feats, like splitting rock with spinning kicks. But his signature move since Enies Lobby is the Diablo Jambe. Sanji spins at high speed to ignite his leg with fire, significantly increasing the power of his kicks. Before Wano, the Diablo Jambe was his peak, allowing him, for example, to damage the Pacifista after the time skip and hit other characters like Oven. Now in Wano, Sanji experienced an awakening of his genetic modifications. What does this mean? Well, it turned out that Sanji, being the son of Judge Vinsmoke, had mad scientist alterations in his DNA that were supposed to give him an exoskeleton and super strength like his brothers, but they never manifested in his childhood thanks to his mother Sora, who humanized him. By using the Germa raid suit several times that he was given in Whole Cake, something in his body awakened those latent genes. Suddenly, Sanji discovered that his durability and physical strength skyrocketed. His body gained a kind of invisible exoskeleton that makes him much more resistant, so much so that in Wano, Queen broke a sword on his neck while trying to cut him. All this without Sanji suffering any damage. He can also regenerate much faster from injuries, and his speed increased. Initially, Sanji was distressed because he feared losing his humanity or emotions, like his brothers, but in the end, he kept his heart and took advantage of the enhancements. With that new durability and strength, Sanji took his Diablo Jam to the next level, Air Dried Jam. This is an enhanced version where the fire on his leg turns blue, indicating an even higher temperature, and he explained that with his mutated blood pumping more powerfully, and perhaps combining the technology of the suit invisibly, he can generate much hotter flames. With the air-dried jam, Sanji literally steamrolled Queen at the climax of their fight, breaking several of his bones with lightning-fast combos. Queen, who had a bounty of 1,320,000,000 and lots of tricks, was decisively defeated. So Sanji is above the level of a typical commander of a Yonkou, at least from the past saga. He is already compared to characters like Marco Katakuri, which is plausible. How did Sanji get that power up? Well, it was a mix of inheritance and circumstances. His 2-year training in the Kamabakura Kingdom made him much stronger, and he gained the recipes for the culinary attack, etc. Although that might be more support, but the big leap came from his Vinsmoke blood. Unintentionally, the raid suit catalyzed his genetic transformation. Sanji decided not to use the suit anymore and broke it after feeling he was becoming a monster, but he kept the physical advantages of it forever. In other words, he became a superhuman, like in Dragon Ball in a way. Tough skin, strong bones, acceleration, and so on. Then, with his usual combat ingenuity, he created the eye-free jump in the middle of the fight, using the new strength to take his classic technique to the maximum. It wasn't so much about prior training, but an emergent in battle backed by his scientific background. But what could improve Sanji even more towards the end? Well, one thing is to completely master his genetic modifications. Now that he knows he has them, even if he disowns his family, he could investigate how they work. Perhaps he can discover new applications. For example, his brothers had specific abilities. One is electric, another uses poison, and he did not show an extra elemental ability. Beyond the fire, he generates himself with friction, and now with his internal power. Maybe his Vinsmoke power is precisely the generation of heat or internal fire, enhanced by emotion. Remember the Hell Memories attack on Layla Gyojin, where he burned in flames from complete rage. He could develop a more powerful version of the eye-free jump, maybe white or black flames, just to say something, multiplying the damage. But since the eye-free jump already surpassed the Devil Jump, it's natural to think that in the final battle, Sanji will have a moment where he pushes his legs to the limit. In terms of Haki, Sanji does possess advanced observation Haki in the sense of being very perceptive. He was able to dodge Katakuri's attacks instinctively to protect someone, and has demonstrated detecting presences as in Punk Hazard. His armament Haki is also assumed to be present, although Oda curiously never drew his leg turning black. We all assume that when hitting tough enemies, Sanji uses basic armament. It may be that Oda hasn't emphasized it much for aesthetic reasons, as the literal black leg wouldn't be very noticeable. Perhaps in future confrontations, we will see Sanji use armament Haki explicitly to, let's say, not break his leg against a Logia, so a possible minor power-up is to confirm and strengthen his armament Haki. He might even reach an advanced level of armament to burn from the inside, combining it with his fiery kicks. That would be terrible for whoever receives it, and Conqueror's Haki. Well, unlike Zoro, Sanji has not shown signs of possessing it. Some fans argue that all members of the monster trio should have it, but honestly, the story does not suggest it for Sanji. He has a lot of determination, yes, but his ambition is different. He wants to find the All Blue and protect his friends, not be the most dominant in something. I would bet that Sanji will not have Conqueror's Haki, and if he does have it, well, it would be a big surprise. I do not consider it necessary for his character or growth. A very interesting narrative aspect of Sanji and the Germa is that, although he broke ties with his family, there are possibilities that in the final war, Sanji might end up leading the forces of the Germa Devil Six in some way. He is the legitimate Prince of Germa, although he renounced it, but his brothers owe him favors since Whole Cake, and Judge surely noticed Sanji's feats. A temporary alliance could occur. Imagine Sanji, who guided the Germa, now leading his army, his clone soldiers, to fight against the world government, because it would benefit both. It would be an ironic but epic development, fulfilling a blood destiny without Sanji betraying his character. He would use that military power for a good cause, not for conquest. However, this is more an argument for personal improvement than for power. In conclusion, Sanji already had his great evolutionary leap in Wano with the eye-free jump and the exoskeleton. His final ceiling could be to fully exploit that combo of genetics plus fire to create even more destructive attacks. He could also establish himself as an inspiring leader in battle, commanding, for example, as I say, the Germa warriors or the Sunny's allies in the final battle, which fits with his role as a renegade prince. But in terms of limitations, Sanji will probably not surpass Zoro and much less Luffy. Oda is very careful about the balance between them. Sanji will continue to be amazing, but Zoro and Luffy are ahead in raw power. That said, Sanji will have his own niche, overwhelming speed, refined technique, and many other things. At the end of the series, I imagine him as the fastest man in the East Blue, so to speak, capable of setting the air on fire with his kicks and taking down high-caliber opponents. Perhaps he will face a Marine Admiral in the final war. That would be a definitive test of his power. And let's not forget his other power, which isn't for fighting, but is important: cooking. Sanji can boost his friends with his banquets. It started with the dishes that restored Luffy's energy. It's not far-fetched that at a critical moment, Sanji's culinary skill could make the difference. For example, preparing something to counteract a poison, or giving Luffy and Zoro an extra energy boost during a meal. It's a rather different ace up the sleeve, but relevant to his role. In summary, Sanji is already quite powerful after Wano, and any future power increase will be more about perfecting what he has obtained than something entirely new. We will see him better understanding his limits and maybe using more creative techniques with what he already has. Ifrit will be his signature from now on, and he might take it to another level in the great final battle. In the meantime, he will continue to be the gallant knight who delivers fiery kicks to anyone who threatens his captain, or worse, a lady in danger. We arrive at Zoro, the number 2 swordsman of the crew and the future best swordsman in the world. Zoro has had quite straightforward progress throughout the series. He keeps taking more powerful swords, cutting tougher enemies, and mastering new sword and haki techniques. Currently, after the events of Wano, he had the sword Enma, one of the 21 Wazamono, the top grade swords. Enma is special because it draws out the haki of its users, extracting it in large quantities. With that sword, Zoro managed to do something impressive. He awakened his advanced Conqueror's haki and imbued it into the swords during the fight with King. That is to say, Zoro can now perform cuts imbued not only with armament haki, but also with the aura of the Conqueror, which greatly amplifies his cutting power. Let's remember that with a brief moment of that, he managed to injure Kaido on the rooftop. This was his great power-up in Wano, confirming that he possesses Conqueror's haki and learning to use it in hand-to-hand combat. Let's recap his current powers. Zoro wields 3 swords, the Santoryu technique, and has several signature techniques, from the classic onigiri to the most recent technique with which he cut King. His current swords are the Wadai Chimoni, the white sword inherited from his childhood friend, Kuina, who is currently Zunesha. The Sandai Katetsu, the cursed sword of lower grade that he used in Logue Town. The Enma, the other Wazamono that replaced Shusui. Zoro can also use his 9-sword technique, the Ashura, which seems like a spiritual manifestation of his combative aura. He looks like a demon with 3 heads and 6 arms with 9 swords. He first demonstrated that technique in Enies lobby, and used it again against Kaido, where it was hinted that it was linked to his Conqueror's haki, as Kaido perceived it and said, "Do you have Conqueror's haki?" As for haki, Zoro has armament haki at a very high level, as he was able to cut through the extremely tough body of Kaido using the secret technique of Ryo, which he learned by observing Higoro and the samurai. His observation haki is quite average. Zoro has never been especially skilled at dodging like Sanji, although he has pretty good reflexes. Interestingly, Zoro has rare cases of perception, like sensing the breath of things to cut steel against Mr. One. But formally, observation is the area of haki where he could improve the most, because he hasn't shown anything like being able to see into the future or at a large range. Now we know what he has, and he has used it offensively. With that, Zoro entered the league of the top characters. But what does Zoro need to reach his goal of being the best swordsman? Mainly 2 things: forging his black swords and acquiring a supreme grade sword. In the world of One Piece, we only know of a few permanent black swords. The most famous is Yoru, Mihawk's sword, which is a Sajo Wazamono. And the other is Shusui, which was originally the sword of the samurai Ryuma. These swords turned black from the continuous use of so much haki. Ihawk explained to Zoro that forging a black sword involves imbuing it with haki so many times and so intensely that it changes color permanently. Zoro has not managed to do that with any of his, so it is expected that Zoro will turn at least 1, if not all of his swords into black blades before the end, as to surpass Mihawk he will have to match him in that achievement. And I would bet that the first will be the Wado Ichimonji, the sword with which he has the most emotional connection. That sword contains Kuina's will, and it is the only one that has been with him from the beginning. Turning the Wado Ichimonji black would be like immortalizing that will. He could also do it with the Enma, since the Enma is a sword hungry for haki, practically made to be a black sword someday. Another option would be to obtain a supreme grade sword, a Sayo Wasamono. Currently none of the three are. The Wado and the Enma are of a great grade, one level below the supreme. The Sandai Kitetsu is of a much lower grade. To be the best swordsman, it would be appropriate for Zoro to wield at least one supreme sword. Since Mihawk has one, Roger had one, even Shanks has one, and Whitebeard also had one. So where would Zoro get such a weapon from? One possibility is that the Enma becomes black. Another is that he replaces the Sandai Kitetsu with its older sister. We know that the higher ranked Kitetsu, the Shodai Kitetsu, is one of the 12 known supreme swords. Many people theorize that the bald Gorosei, Inuzojuro, possesses the Shodai Kitetsu sword because the design of his sword matches identically with the Kitetsu. If that were true, eventually that sword could come into play, and it wouldn't be far-fetched for Zoro to end up measuring his sword against that character's. Another option would be that in Wano he had the Niigata, but Zoro never got to use it, it remained stored. It could be that in the future Zoro obtains the Niigata or the Shodai. In any case, if I see Zoro wielding a higher grade Kitetsu to complete his final trio, it would be poetic. He has carried the youngest one for a long time and might replace it with its ancestor in the final stretch, thus taking on the ultimate curse of that line of katanas. Another possible area of growth is observation haki. As I mentioned, Zoro is mainly about armament and now Conqueror. His observation is standard. Does Zoro need advanced observation haki to see the future? Maybe not to be the best swordsman, but it could help him against certain rivals. For example, if he faces someone super fast or who uses tricks, imagine against a Shiryu of the Rain who can become invisible with the Shusuke no Mi, Zoro would have to sharpen his senses to not be caught off guard. A Zoro who can sense an invisible or hidden enemy thanks to observation haki would be covering that weakness. So I don't rule out that Zoro might train a bit more in that aspect, or that in the final battle under stress he might also awaken some extra level of observation. Let's remember that in the battle against Mr. One, he was attacked from blind angles, and Zoro managed to react by hearing the breath of the steel, which is like a very primitive form of observation haki. I don't expect Zoro to have a level of haki like Katakuri's, but he could have his combat instinct more refined, and this would complete his package. But how overpowered could Zoro end up being? Well, if all the above is fulfilled, he would have 3 black swords, 1 of supreme grade, mastered Conqueror's haki, maximum armament, and decent observation. Frankly, he would be at the level of legends like Rayleigh, and that is the goal. Zoro will surely end the series as the strongest swordsman in the world, possibly having defeated Mihawk in a duel, or symbolically surpassed him in some way, and perhaps having accomplished some memorable feat, like cutting something impossible. Already in the final war, let's see Zoro make a cut that goes down in history like Mihawk cutting that iceberg in Marineford, but much more impressive. As for narrative limitations, Zoro has always been presented as the second in command, the right-hand man of the Pirate King. His power should not overshadow Luffy's, but it must be overwhelming enough so that no one doubts he is the ideal first mate. Oda already achieves this. In the Wano arc, Zoro shown almost as much as Luffy and defeated King. I doubt he will have another saga where he stands out as much, but in the final battle, there might be a key moment. Zoro against Mihawk 2, a Zoro against Shiryu, a Zoro measuring the sword against some group. In any of these scenarios, Zoro will probably demonstrate the fruit of his final training. That is, he will reveal his first sword turned black or unleash a new, more powerful Ashura technique. There have also been theories about his closed left eye, which might hide some secret, but it could just be a scar without much significance. I won't delve into that because it's too uncertain. If it turns out there's something with his eye, like a hidden power, it would be a very unexpected twist, but it is most likely just a training wound with Mihawk and a symbol of his sacrifice. In summary, Zoro is already at the peak of his journey. He just needs to add the finishing touches, forge the swords with haki at the maximum level, possibly change a supreme sword, refine his observation haki if the story requires it. With this, there will be no rival with a sword or without one who can match him. His name will be feared across all the seas as the new Hawkeye. Zoro's path is very straightforward, but that doesn't make it any less exciting because each step involves colossal challenges. The final step could even be defeating Draculae Mihawk, the current #1 in dueling, which will surely be legendary. And when Zoro achieves that, he will have fulfilled his promise to Kina and Luffy to never lose again until he becomes the best swordsman. There is no narrative limiter preventing Zoro from reaching that point. On the contrary, his growth is practically a fact established by the dream he pursues. So get ready to see Zoro perform feats much more absurd than what we have seen so far from now until the end of One Piece. Finally, we close with Captain Monkey D. Luffy and future King of the Pirates. Luffy is undoubtedly the character whose power has grown exponentially in the latest arc, to the point where many will say he is already broken or too strong, and it's that Luffy already reached his known power peak in Wano and perfected it in Egghead by awakening the new nature of his devil fruit and mastering all types of advanced haki. Let's briefly review his current state. Although most already know it, Luffy ate the Gomu Gomu no Mi as a child, which we thought was a rubber paramecia, but it turned out to actually be the Hito Hito no Mi model Nika, the sun god Nika, and this fruit would grant him a rubber body with cartoon-like properties, especially after awakening. Luffy developed throughout his series his second gear, third gear, fourth gear techniques, each to overcome recent challenges, but the big leap came in Wano, where on the brink of defeat with Kaido, he awakened the fifth gear, his Nika form, where he fully unleashes the imaginative power of that fruit. In Gear 5, Luffy becomes literally free in fighting style. He can do any cartoon-like craziness he imagines, inflate his body to gigantic sizes, turn the ground into rubber, punch the air, transform into absurd figures, like when he pulled out a baseball bat or put on sunglasses. It is a very unpredictable and extremely effective power because it does not follow normal rules of physics. With this form, Luffy defeated Kaido, who was called the strongest creature in the world. And let's not forget that before Gear 5, he had already mastered the 3 forms of Haki at high levels. Observation Haki at an advanced level, which allowed him to see the future in the fight against Katakuri. Armament Haki at an advanced level, where he learned Ryu and Wano, being able to destroy from within. Advanced Conqueror's Haki, which he also used against Kaido. Luffy literally checked all the power-up boxes he could. Result? As of today, Luffy is a recognized emperor, a Yonkou, and has a bounty of 3 billion, standing among the strongest characters in the world. But what more can be expected from Luffy in terms of power? Well, here's the curious part. Possibly very little. Regarding new abilities, Luffy stated that in his very Gear 5, it's like the peak, the freest and most powerful form he desired. The idea of a 6th gear has been speculated by many fans, but there are many people who say this doesn't make sense and that it's most likely not going to happen. Instead, they say Luffy's progression would be to master what has already been awakened. For example, perfecting that 5th gear they used against Kaido, and there we saw him have certain issues as he ran out of energy quickly. He aged a little for a few seconds by pushing the limits with the whole time thing, and it's speculated that over time, Luffy will learn to use his Nika form much more efficiently without losing so much stamina. Perhaps he will develop new moves within the 5th gear, new ways to attack, because with his cartoon body, literally the limit is imagination, and we already saw him make a giant fist the size of an island against Kaido. He could invent, I don't know, a mode where he permanently turns the entire environment into rubber or even faster attacks, but I insist, these are variations within his current power. Regarding Haki, Luffy already possesses the top level. At most, he will continue refining it. He could improve his future sight to the level of Katakuri or more, his future sight to the level of Shanks or more. His Conqueror's Haki might reach the finesse of Shanks as well, who has a Conqueror's Haki so powerful that it can intimidate an admiral without even touching. Learning that kind of control, but essentially there is no new Haki to discover or anything. It's about strengthening what he has already achieved. The story places Luffy in a curious position. He is already one of the strongest, but he still has formidable enemies to defeat, mainly Blackbeard and Admiral Akainu. Additionally, there is talk of the enigmatic possible final villain, IMU, from the world government. How will Luffy fight if he is already at his peak? Well, the answer would lie more in strategy, the conditions of the fight, and the inherent willpower factor. Luffy is the heir to the will of D, and his Nika fruit has a mythical liberator component. It is possible that at the climax, Luffy will reach an even higher spiritual mental state. No tangible power-up as such, but a conviction so absolute that his Conqueror's Haki becomes unstoppable. For example, if he faces Imu, who might have some divine power or an ancient weapon, Luffy would need all his creativity and determination to overcome. What if it is said that Luffy will not keep breaking the power meter with something new? Well, they say the plot no longer requires it. At this point, the audience knows that Luffy is capable of facing anyone. If Oda introduced a Gear 6 or an extra transformation, it might feel repetitive and unjustified. Also, Luffy says that his Nika is his peak, so we'll trust that this peak is enough. The only thing that could be interesting is to see Luffy use the 5th gear creatively in different situations. For example, using his Toon Force fighting style to counter Blackbeard's unusual powers, who has the Darkness and Earthquake fruit, a devastating combination. Or let's imagine Luffy fighting against Akainu. The magma is deadly, but maybe with the 5th gear, Luffy does something crazy like turning Akainu's magma into rubber for an instant. If his power can affect elemental abilities, which we still don't know, it's theoretical territory. And another issue mentioned is that now Luffy is a mythical Zoan, which usually comes with the fruit's own will. In his case, the spirit of Nika, the god of freedom, seems to resonate with him, but there could be more mysteries about that fruit, that Luffy unravels some special ability linked to bringing the Dance of Liberation, or something like that, which Luffy could reproduce. This is more about narrative and mysticism than a power-up for fighting, but it could manifest as a super symbolic final technique that defeats the final antagonist. In terms of story logic, Luffy is destined to surpass all his predecessors, including Roger. In the end, Luffy will be the strongest and freest man in the world, the king of the pirates. He is on that path. There will be no one above Luffy in the end, not even Blackbeard or IMU, as they will be defeated. In fact, it is expected that Luffy will do what Roger could not, probably overthrow the oppressive world government by igniting the dawn of freedom. His fruit is literally the embodiment of freedom through laughter and imagination. So more than these new power-ups, we will see Luffy using his current abilities in ingenious ways to fulfill that liberating role. For example, a powerful image would be Luffy using his giant elastic body to protect his allies from a catastrophic attack, or him laughing in the middle of the final battle, inspiring everyone. On a pure combat level, we definitely expect Luffy to face Blackbeard, a complicated rival because the Yami Yami nullifies fruits and also has the power of the earthquake, but perhaps with this 5th gear and superior haki, this can be countered, and obviously it is expected that he will defeat Akainu, settling scores for what happened to Ace. These victories would not require a new gear, but probably a combination of everything he has learned, Conqueror's haki, and Nika's creativity. Kamushi is a fighter. He might be the exception where Luffy has to surpass his limits once more, but they say they don't believe it will translate into a 6th gear. Rather, it would be Luffy pushing himself to the ultimate extreme of the 5th gear, perhaps risking his life in the process. In conclusion, Luffy has already reached the peak of the mountain in terms of tangible power-ups. His task right now is to reign over that peak. This means improving his level of control over Gear 5, so he can fight longer without getting exhausted and continue strengthening his haki to legendary levels. That his Conqueror's haki is so powerful that no one with a weak will can even get close, for example. We won't see a new crazy transformation, but what he already has is so versatile that it can still surprise us a lot. Luffy has basically become a cartoon character fighting in a relatively serious world, and that opens up a range of unpredictable comedic and epic moments. And the best part is that even though he's overpowered, Luffy is still very vulnerable if he's careless. His 5th gear has the drawback of energy consumption, so all the final battles will still have tension, because no matter how strong he is, there are opponents like Teach who could have tricks up their sleeve that could put him in trouble. But let's be realistic, Luffy will end up being the strongest character in One Piece, period. He will surpass even the legendary Roger in feats, because he will achieve what Roger did not. By then, his bounty will surely reflect that greatness. We can imagine that it slightly exceeds Roger's, perhaps around 5,600,000,000 berries, nodding to Gomu, which is 5 and 6 in Japanese. Although the figure is the least important, it is symbolic to think that Luffy will be recognized worldwide not only as the king of the pirates, but as the man who defeated the most fearsome enemies of the era. At this point, there would be no power-up to seek. His true strength would lie in the alliance of his power with his friends and his unbreakable inherited will. Each Straw Hat has their own path of growth, defined both by their ambitions and the narrative of One Piece. Some, like Luffy or Zoro, have already reached or are very close to reaching their maximum potential and only need to refine details. Others, like Nami and Usopp, might still gain 1 or 2 more tricks up their sleeve, but without stepping out of their role of intellect and support. Characters like Sanji, Franky, or Robin, who received recent upgrades, would consolidate those advancements, perhaps with something extra, technological in Franky's case, haki in Robin and Sanji's case, and for their part, they might not change radically from that end, but that does not diminish their value in what they contribute to the team. The important thing is for Oda to maintain the balance. Not everyone needs to be at the level of gods, but they should be competent enough for the Straw Hat crew to face any challenge. At the end of the story, we will see the Straw Hats become a legendary crew with the Pirate King Luffy at the helm, backed by the strongest swordsman, Zoro, the deadly fire cook Sanji, a great fishman helmsman, Jinbei, a navigator who controls the weather, Nami, a sniper who inspires courage in an army, Usopp, a demonic archaeologist expert in world history, Robin, a cyborg with state-of-the-art weaponry, Franky, a musician from the beyond, Brook, and an adorable monster doctor, Chopper. Each one in their ultimate role, with none more or less. They will go as far as their dream and the logic of the story allow them to go. Honestly, it's going to be very epic to watch. First thing to explain is that the world of One Piece seems to move in cycles and a predetermined destiny, something that Eiichiro Oda himself has hinted at many times in the series. In fact, the word destiny has appeared explicitly at completely key moments. An early example was when Luffy received his first bounty. Makino commented that Luffy was fulfilling his dream, and the mayor, Cubslap, wondered aloud if it was his dream or his destiny. This idea that Luffy's achievements might be predestined has been underlying since the very beginning of the story. It's no coincidence. Eiichiro Oda has left clues that in the world of One Piece, there is an inherited will that spans eras and certain events, almost as if it were the work of destiny. Another very revealing moment is the final speech of Whitebeard, Edward Newgate. Before dying, he tells Teach that he is not the one Roger was waiting for, hinting that there is someone designated to continue Roger's will. In that same statement, Whitebeard talks about how since ancient times there are those who inherit the will, and predicts that one day a person will come who will challenge the world and carry centuries of history on their shoulders. These words practically describe a kind of prophecy, suggesting that there is a destined path, a chosen one who will fulfill the tasks that even Roger could not complete in his time. Let's remember that Gall D. Roger himself, after finding Laugh Tale, commented laughing, "Joy boy, I wish I had been born in your era. We arrived too soon." This confirms that Roger realized he had arrived too early to fulfill that destined mission, passing the task to someone from the future, most likely our Luffy. Even characters like Shanks have been involved in this notion of destiny. Shanks himself, speaking with a former member of Roger's pirates, Scopper Gaban, referred to himself as the destined child or the destined man, implying that Shanks had a very special role to fulfill. This is very interesting because it fits with the idea that Shanks has acted behind the scenes to guide certain events, like recovering the Hito Hito model Nika fruit, which ended up in Luffy's hands, something that might not be a coincidence. And in summary, One Piece has shown us that destiny and the inheritance of will are central themes, from the will of D to prophecies like that of Fishman Island, which Madame Shirley predicted that Luffy will destroy Fishman Island, an act linked to the dawn that everyone is waiting for. Everything indicates that there is a course of history that must occur. My personal interpretation of all these clues is that the story of One Piece operates in a kind of vicious circle, with events repeating throughout the ages in a very similar way. In other words, there are cyclical patterns. There always emerges an individual with the will of the type of Joy Boy who challenges the tyrannical world order and the world government, attempting to bring a new era of freedom, and there is always a final confrontation between these forces. This would have occurred not only 800 years ago in the Void Century with the original Joy Boy against the ancestors of Imu, but perhaps repeatedly since then. Possibly every few generations an heir to that will emerges, a DI with the spirit of freedom who tries to overthrow the tyrant of the time, but so far has always failed, restarting the cycle again. That is why the world government has been ruling for 800 years without being overthrown. After each failed attempt, they erase from history the evidence of that uprising so that the world forgets and the status quo continues. A perfect example of these deliberate historical gaps is the God Valley incident. It happened only 38 years ago, and yet it was literally erased from the map and the books as if it never happened. If the government made an entire island disappear from the records because of what happened there, what might they have done over the centuries with similar events? To understand how Oda might have been telling the end of One Piece for a long time, we must look at two great wars we have already seen in the series. The Battle of God Valley, which happened 38 years ago in the story, and the War of Marineford, which in the present occurred just a couple of years ago in Luffy's timeline, that is, 2 years ago. At first glance, they are different conflicts, but you will see that they hold very surprising parallels, and Oda has created an intentional reflection between God Valley and Marineford. And this is crucial because the great final war that is approaching will follow this same pattern, but on a much larger scale. Let's look point by point at the similarities between God Valley and Marineford because they are the key to deciphering what the final war will be like. The trigger for the conflict will be a kidnapping. Both clashes began because the bad side, the government or the navy, captured someone, triggering the reaction of the good side, the pirates. In God Valley, as revealed in the latest chapters, the kidnapped person was none other than Shaki, who before being the bartender of Sabaody and Rayleigh's partner, turned out to be a legendary pirate in her youth, and was revealed to have been the Empress of Amazon Lily decades ago and the most coveted woman of her time. Her kidnapping shocked the world at that time and attracted the attention of the most powerful pirates. In Marineford, on the other hand, the kidnapped person who was sentenced to public execution was Portgas D. Ace, the son of Roger and a commander of Whitebeard. Both situations set the machinery of war in motion. In God Valley, Roger's crew went to rescue Shacky, and in Marineford, Whitebeard's fleet went to rescue Ace. Oda is telling us that something similar will happen in the final war. Someone important will be captured, their life in danger, and this will cause all the factions of the world to converge for the decisive confrontation. Then we have a young Marine with a conscience who questions the morality of the battle. In Marineford, we saw Kobe, a rookie Marine protected by Garp, suffer a crisis of conscience in the middle of the massacre. He even stood in front of a Kainu, willing to stop the war. Fed up with the senseless slaughter, well, in God Valley, there was apparently an equivalent role, none other than Monkey D. Dragon, yes, Luffy's father. He was there as a young Marine under Garp's command. Recent chapters confirmed a fan theory. Dragon served in the Navy in his youth. It is suspected that what he witnessed in God Valley, the cruelty of the world nobles, and perhaps the injustice of having to protect them, horrified him to the point of deserting. Dragon questioned everything the Marines represented that very day, which explains why years later he founded the Revolutionary Army. It is a very powerful parallel. Both Kobe at Marineford and Dragon at God Valley represent justice within the Marines. Those who see the error of protecting evil, the Celestials or corrupt politicians, and they rebel. Perhaps in the final war, we will see that this archetype is no longer needed, because many Marines will awaken to the truth, or because the final conflict will be so clear, the true face of the government will be exposed, that there will be no doubt about what is right. In any case, it's interesting to note how Oda placed Dragon in God Valley in the same way he placed Kobe in Marineford. Then we have the point that someone tries to prevent a certain pirate from going to war. In Marineford, Shanks intercepted Kaido before he reached the battlefield. Let's remember that Kaido, upon learning of the imminent war, wanted to take advantage of the chaos to attack Whitebeard, or simply cause a commotion. Shanks literally blocked his way, off-screen, obviously, and even with a duel against Kaido in between, he managed to reach Marineford in time to end the war. In God Valley, there was a similar incident. According to what has been revealed in the chapters, Captain Rock's D. Zebek had a confrontation with the Giant King Harold. And yes, until I get used to Rocks, I will keep calling him Rocks. I know his name is Davy D. Zebek, but it will be hard for me to change his name. It seems that Rocks was trying to recruit Harold for his cause, and Harold opposed him. A tremendous battle between Rocks and the Giant Harold. And this giant Herald was sent by the world government to intercept Rocks, making a clear parallel with Kaido and Shanks, where a very powerful pirate goes to war, and there is another who must stop him from going. Only that in the case of Harold and Rocks, we know that it finally did happen. This role of preventing reinforcements could also be repeated in the final war. One possibility is that someone, perhaps an admiral like Fujitora, might try to prevent a certain secondary pirate group from joining the battle. I think, for example, of the Cross Guild of Buggy, Crocodile, and Mihawk. They might want to join the chaos for their own agenda, and the Navy will send someone to stop them on the way. Can you imagine Fujitora intercepting Mihawk and company? It would be an interesting clash before the Great War, with Fujitora perhaps doing it by orders, but doubting deep down. It's just speculation, but it fits well in the pattern of God Valley, of Harold against Rocks and Marineford, of Shanks against Kaido. Somehow there would be attempts to sabotage the meeting of certain contenders, although in the end, practically everyone would end up involved. Then we would have the sides of the war, and again, we can draw a certain parallel with God Valley. As for Roger's crew, it would obviously be the Straw Hats, who this time would be reinforced with none other than the great Mugiwara fleet to show that they are stronger, and also providing a strong argument to win, while still drawing a parallel with the person who obviously carries the same will that Luffy carries. Roger's pirates are a mirror, a parallel to the Straw Hats, meaning that the comparison between them is very evident and they will represent Roger's side in this final war. Then on the opposite side, in God Valley, we would have the Rock's Pirates, the most feared crew at the time, making the God Valley incident even more dangerous and more famous among those who know about it. In Marineford, although the main villain was the Navy for executing Ace, we also had Marshal D. Teach, Blackbeard, in the mix. Yes, I will continue to call him Marshal D. Teach, even though his name is Davy D. Teach and his new crew bursting in at the end to take advantage of the chaos. In fact, Blackbeard arrived at Marineford with destructive intentions. He killed Whitebeard and stole his Gura Gura fruit and began to sink Marineford with earthquakes. He himself declared his intention to destroy the entire island using Whitebeard's power. This is a direct parallel with God Valley, as it is known that God Valley ended up destroyed and literally sunk beneath the waves after the battle. Marineford almost met the same fate at the hands of Teach, if not for Shanks arriving in time to stop the madness. Teach chose to retreat upon seeing Shanks. Logical. It's chilling to think that Oda was about to show us another God Valley in the present. Marineford would have disappeared from the map as well, sunk into the sea. If the war had continued a few more minutes, who knows what would have happened? Even Teach himself hinted at it with much sarcasm. This detail connects both events and makes it clear that Marineford was a modern and smaller scale reflection. From God Valley, then we have the legendary figures putting an end to the battle. At Marineford, Shanks, with his mere presence, declares the war over. If anyone still wants to fight, let them come against us. And neither side dared to prolong the conflict after Shanks' arrival. His weight as a Yonku balanced the battle in that final moment. In God Valley, we know that the official victors were Garp and Roger together, but we also know that Figurlin Garland was involved, who was a holy knight present on the island. This is interesting because now we know that Shanks and Garling are directly connected. Shanks is Garling's son and was born in God Valley, being rescued as a baby by Roger. We could say that Shanks and Garling represent opposite sides of the same coin. Garling served the government in God Valley, and Shanks became a pirate. One initiated the massacre of God Valley, triggering the tournament on that island, and the other stopped the massacre at Marineford. It's a game of generational parallels. I wouldn't be surprised if in the final war Shanks plays a key role again, perhaps facing his father or his twin brother, Figureland Shamrock, which would drive us all crazy. Just imagine the scene, Shanks against Shamrock, twin brothers separated by fate, each on a different side. It would be the perfect rhyme to what happened decades ago with Garling and God Valley. Of course, with Oda, you never know. He might kill Shanks before that war to give us an emotional blow. We know Blackbeard has unfinished business with him. Even so, to date, Shanks has always appeared to balance the wars, and this dynamic could repeat itself. After reviewing all this, it is clear that Oda deliberately mirrored God Valley and Marineford. In fact, Marineford was called the War of the Strongest, a title very similar to how we might imagine God Valley was described in the annals of history. It is no coincidence. Oda was not only showing a great climax in the middle of the series, but also giving us a preview of the scale and structure of the final war. He himself hinted at it in interviews. He commented that the final saga will make the Marineford War look cute or small in comparison, and these statements probably sound familiar because at the time it was said that Marineford would look cute next to the war because of the Wano War. Well, this was a translation error that many people interpreted as they wanted, but Oda was referring all along to the final war. And indeed, something huge is coming. If Marineford was an appetizer, the final war will be the full banquet. We can infer that just as Marineford seemed small compared to God Valley in terms of danger, let's remember that practically all the legends were at God Valley. Roger, Garp, Rayleigh, a young Whitebeard, Big Mom, a young Kaido, Shaki, some Gorosei around, the God's Knights, even Dragon, Baby Shanks, Teach. The final war would eclipse Marineford because even more powerful people will gather in one place, with much higher stakes. Let's not forget that after Marineford, Luffy rang the Ox Bell and married Jawaz 16 times, symbolically marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. It was a prelude to the dawn that is about to come. The true fight for the Dawn, the one that will decide the fate of the world, is destined to occur soon in the story. And speaking of destiny, chapter 1159 of the manga is titled The Island of Destiny, alluding to God Valley. Oda practically hints that God Valley was an island where destiny brought together great names for a transcendental event. Think about the incredible coincidence, or predestined coincidence, that on this island, Roger and all his crew, Garp and Marine units, Rox and his pirates with future Yonko included, Young Dragon, Garling and all the Divine Knights, some Gorosei, Shanks and Shamrock as babies. Half of the powerful world was in one place. That doesn't happen every day. It seemed almost written by destiny. And now, in the final saga, we are seeing a similar convergence of certain characters towards certain places. In Egghead, there were already quite a few powerful people. In Elbaf too, and even Imu, the king in the shadows, is aware of these cycles. In recent chapters, Imu ordered drastic measures against Elbaf, knowing that the next great war could be brewing there. In fact, Imu has personally gone to the front in Elbaf because he understands that the time for that confrontation has come. That is to say, Imu has lived through several repetitions over the centuries. Possibly he is immortal or of a long-lived race, or something that allows him to live a long time. And he recognized the signs that another war like the one at God Valley is approaching. Another destiny of Joy Boy against Imu, but this time, he senses it could be different. Just as Roger said, now the right moment might truly be arriving. Summarizing the lessons from God Valley and Marineford, we have a clear outline of how the final war will be in terms of its setup and the key pieces involved. Let's look at those elements one by one, and the candidates we have in the present for each role. Continuing with the parallel, the final war would start, as I said, with a kidnapping or capture that would shock the entire world and force all sides to act. Now then, who could be that captured person whose situation unleashes absolute chaos? This is a very difficult question, and I have thought a lot about it. For it to be the greatest war ever seen, the hostage must be someone whose fate matters to multiple factions, not just Luffy. Moreover, it must be such a serious event that even pirates who would not normally collaborate with each other or entire countries would mobilize. So let's evaluate some possibilities. The first, Monkey D. Luffy. If Luffy himself were captured by the world government, it would undoubtedly light a fuse. His allies and fleet would come, as well as his family, Dragon and Garp. But perhaps this situation might feel a bit anticlimactic. Luffy is usually the one who leads, not so much the one who needs rescuing, but as a call to the final war, it works very well in principle. But there's a small problem. Why, for example, would Teach's side show up if Luffy were imprisoned? We might think that Teach could go to eliminate him definitively, or to steal something from him, his devil fruit. But the truth is, it feels a bit strange, and I don't know how it would fit. Then, the character of Shanks could indeed go to protect his bet on the new era, Luffy, because he is his friend, but the character of Teach falls apart for me, and it's a very important side. Then we have the option of capturing Teach. His crew would obviously try to save him, but I doubt that heroes like Luffy would go to rescue Teach. Rather, at most, they might take the opportunity to fight him by force, but it's a bit strange. Besides, Teach would hardly let himself be captured alive at this point. It is more logical for him to be the instigator, not the victim. Another option is Boa Hancock, and many people thought of Boa as a parallel to Shaki. Both were empresses of Amazon Lily, and if Boa were captured by the Navy, let's remember that after the evolution of the Shichibukai, she was already in danger, and Teach even attacked her trying to steal her fruit. Luffy would surely go to rescue her. We already saw how important Boa is to him and his friend, and the debt he feels for her saving his crew. Teach might also be interested because he already tried to capture her once. He wanted the Mero Mero no Mi. However, Boa alone might not attract everyone. For example, would Shanks or the revolutionaries come just for Boa? Her capture would only matter to Luffy and Amazon Lily practically, maybe to Teach, but if he withdrew from Amazon Lily out of fear of Rayleigh, I don't see him being so obsessed as to get involved and risk everything in a great final war for her. Another option is Nico Robin. Robin is a constant target of the government. If the Gorosei or Imu managed to capture Robin, it would be very serious. She is the only one in principle who can read the Poneglyphs. Luffy would go to the ends of the earth to save Robin, as he already did in Enies Lobby. Dragon and the Revolutionary Army appreciate her. Dragon took her in for 2 years. He might have a huge interest in ensuring Robin does not fall into the hands of the world government. Teach might also need Robin to find Laugh Tale, I don't know. Even Shanks might understand the importance of protecting Robin for the sake of the truth of the Void Century. This is a quite strong possibility in terms of the storyline. One downside is that Oda already did an entire arc about saving Robin in Enies Lobby, and repeating it on a larger scale would be symmetrical, but perhaps repetitive, unless now the enemy is IMU or Teach, and the scale is global, of course. Other options are Sabo or Vivi. After the events at Mary Joieuse, both Sabo and Vivi have been in danger. Sabo was falsely accused of killing Cobra and was almost captured, although he managed to escape from Mary Joieuse with injuries. Vivi disappeared after the reverie, and we know that Imu showed special interest in her. If Imu captures Vivi, that would put Luffy, because of his promise to Cobra and his friendship with Vivi, into action. The revolutionaries too. Sabo and Vivi escaped together. Sabo might have protected her, and perhaps all of Alabasta clamoring for their princess. However, would Teach move for Vivi? Only if there were something to gain, maybe use her to blackmail for Pluton, since Pluton was related to Arabasta or something like that. Sabo in danger, on the other hand, would mobilize Dragon and the revolutionaries. Also Luffy, who is his brother, and even former comrades from the revolutionary army. Sabo was already the protagonist of the climax in Lulusia, survived an attack from Imu, and is very beloved by the public. A public execution of Sabo, the assassin of King Cobra, could be the government's move to discredit the revolutionaries and lure Dragon into a trap. Teach might try to steal Sabo's Mera Mera, but he already has enough fruits. Difficult. Another option is Monkey D. Dragon. This option resonates more and more in my mind. Dragon is the most wanted man in the world, leader of the revolutionary army. If the government or Teach manages to capture him, it would be the event of the century. Imagine the public execution of Dragon being announced in the plaza of Mary Joieuse. In the style of Ace, Luffy would have a powerful personal reason to go. Although he hardly knows his father, it would be his chance to bridge that gap, and obviously he would want to save him because of blood ties and because he is Sabo's mentor, and Sabo and all the revolutionaries would do the impossible to free their leader. The whole world would be watching because Dragon is the symbol of rebellion against the government. His death would be a message of terror for the oppressed people, and his rescue a sign of hope. And Teach? Well, if my suspicions are correct, Teach could be the one orchestrating Dragon's capture. Something like this could happen. Dragon launches an assault on Mary Joieuse, which might already be underway because we've seen someone attacking Mary Joieuse. Imu and Teach might face off at some critical moment, two villains clashing over different interests, and Teach, with his cunning, could defeat Imu and even steal his fruit, for example, if Imu possesses a mythical fruit like Abyss or some power. And in the midst of that chaos, Teach could capture Dragon, bruised after the battle, and present his capture as a trophy to win over the rest of the government or to lure Luffy into his territory. I can even imagine Teach proposing a public execution of Dragon to show that he now holds the true power of the world government. That is, after having defeated Imu and taken the throne of the world, his introductory act would be having captured the most wanted man in the world, the leader of the revolutionary army, and demonstrating that with him, revolutions are over, that now he is the one in charge. It would be the perfect parallel. Teach assumes the role that the Navy had in Marineford, and Dragon assumes the role of Ace as the Condemned. Only this time, the Condemned is the greatest political enemy of the government. A moment like this would definitely make all roads lead to the final war, on that island of destiny, or wherever it may be. Surely it would be Mary Joieuse, I suppose. Honestly, the capture of Dragon makes a lot of sense. He fulfills being someone of global importance. He personally connects with Luffy and Sabo, involves the revolutionaries, and therefore every oppressed country allied with them. And it could involve Teach if he positions himself as the new tyrant. Additionally, it would have a strong emotional weight with Luffy meeting his father in extreme circumstances, and also symbolic, the revolutionary leader being judged in the last Great War, a public execution like what happened with Roger that started the Great Pirate Era. Of course, obviously this is a theory, and Oda could surprise us with another victim or even multiple simultaneous captures. I don't rule out that they might capture more than one person. The government could set up a bizarre final coliseum with several sentenced individuals. For example, Dragon, Sabo, and Vivi. Imagine the more bait, the more participants they would attract. In God Valley, there was a tournament perversely organized by the Tenryubito, where Shaki was the prize. The evil of the world nobles reached the point of auctioning human lives in a deadly game. For the final war, it wouldn't be surprising if Imu or whoever is in charge attempts a similar spectacle. A broadcasted public execution, a trap to gather all the enemies in one place. In any case, the outbreak would start with a calculated or prophesied incident involving rescuing someone crucial. Once this catalyst occurs, what sides will we see form in the great final war? If God Valley and Marineford teach us anything, it's that there will be three main factions: the heroes, the Revolutionary Allied Pirates, the villains, the world government and their equivalents, and a third chaotic party, an ambitious pirate with their own style, a Rocks or Blackbeard style. But this time, the lines might cross a little due to unexpected alliances. Let's take a look. The Straw Hats and allies. Roger's heir. This side is clear. Luffy and his crew would be the modern equivalent of Roger and his, that is, the role of the Dawn. However, unlike Roger, Luffy would not go with just 10 members. Luffy has a large fleet of allies, those who swore loyalty to him in Dressrosa, numbering in the thousands. This great Mugiwara fleet will surely gather for the final battle, fulfilling the promise to come when Luffy needs them. This reflects how the pirates in God Valley were strong, but relatively few, while Luffy will have a considerably greater force, because this time the Inherited will must win, and for that, they need more firepower than in previous cycles. We would see characters like Cavendish, Bartolomeo, Shai, Hadrudin, and all the giants all fighting under Luffy's flag. Possibly allied kingdoms would also join, like Dressrosa, Arabasta, if Vili is involved, the Mink tribe, samurais from Wano. It would be a multicolored liberation army led by Luffy. At Marineford, Luffy arrived with a small, heterogeneous group: Ivankov, Inazuma, Jinbei, Crocodile, and even some enemies cooperating. In the final war, that idea will multiply. Former enemies could become allies of convenience. Perhaps we will see Crocodile and Mihawk from Cross Guild fight against the government side by side with Luffy. It is possible, since the Cross Guild hates the government and wants to overthrow its power system. It would echo how Garp and Roger set aside enmities in God Valley for a greater good. The world government and the Knights of God, the traditional villains. The great antagonist is Imu and his entourage, the Gorosei and the Holy Knights. Imu is the equivalent of the evil king who was behind the scenes in past eras. 800 years ago, he was the one who defeated the original Joy Boy. In God Valley, Imu was also present through the Holy Knights. Now, Imu faces the threat of the D again, specifically from Luffy, and is taking desperate measures such as destroying kingdoms like Lulusia, deploying weapons like the Mother Flame, or moving the Divine Knights to Elbaf. We can expect the world government to present in the final war its most terrible weapons: the Gorosei themselves, the God Knights led by Garling and Shamrock, perhaps armies of pacifists or Seraphim if they still control them. However, here comes a variable: Teach, because there is a very strong possibility that by the time the final war reaches its climax, the world government as such will no longer be commanded by Imu, but by Marshal D. Teach, and yes, again I know he is called Davy D. Teach, but I don't care. It sounds crazy, but let's take it step by step. Teach has been consolidating power. Right now, he is a Yonko. He has two OP fruits, the Yami Yami and the Gura Gura, and he always desires more. He has always had an air of a final antagonist against Luffy. He's another with the initial D, heir to the will of rocks in a certain sense. Many fans speculate that Teach could take advantage of the imminent chaos to usurp the throne. Let's imagine that in the first phase of the war, Luffy and allies manage to expose and weaken Imu, maybe destroy some weapon or something like that. Let's imagine, as I said before, that when Dragon and Imu are about to face off, Teach takes advantage, defeats both, finishes off Imu, and is the one to start that final war. This time leading the world government, claiming the power of the empty throne for himself. He could even steal Imu's ability if it comes from a fruit, and we've seen that Imu seems to use a power called Abyss or Shadow Control to possess certain bodies. Blackbeard would become the new world sovereign, and this would be a tremendous twist, but it would fit his character. He wants the world for himself. Let's remember that Rox D. Zebek, Teach's ideological mentor, aspired to be king of the world and challenge the celestial dragons. Let's remember that Rox stood before Imu and told him that besides being a fan of Davy Jones, he still couldn't harm him, but that he would return. Well, Teach inherited Zebek's will. Even his base is the former pirate island of Hachinosu, which belonged to Rox, so Teach could succeed where Zebek failed, defeat Imu, and take his place. And there's a curious detail: one of Blackbeard's ships is called Saber of Zebek, and Blackbeard himself is obsessed with the dark history of the Void Century. He sought out Pudding to read the poneglyphs and knows things about the past. His fruit rarity seems very curious. If Teach takes control of the government or temporarily allies with them, many Marines might follow him. Think about Akainu. Would he obey Teach? Maybe not. Akainu hates pirates. But be careful, because he is still a military man, and having overthrown the current head of the world government and placing himself at levels of power, he might simply consider it as a change of position and everything would remain the same. So, be very careful, because even though Akainu is the way he is, this time Teach would stop being a pirate to become the governor of the world government. In any case, it is possible that we will see a unified band of villains that includes Blackbeard and his crew, plus what remains of the world government. A Blackbeard, perhaps with authority over, for example, the God Knights, would be terrifying, since remember that if, for whatever reason, he takes IMU'S fruit and gains its power, he could have control over the God Knights. Can you imagine Teach commanding Garling, Shamrock, and company as if they were his new generals? It could happen if he defeats IMU and steals his fruit. As for Blackbeard's crew itself, it is already parallel to Rock's. Interestingly, many have noticed similarities. Katarina Devon, the Moonhunter, is a cruel pirate who could be compared to Big Mom physically. Avalo Pizarro also has traits that could be very similar to Kaido, a kind of mirror effect between the two crews, and of course Teach corresponds to Zebek. They are not exact equivalents, but the idea of this worst generation or allied pirates in a single group does somewhat repeat. Teach's side would be the modern incarnation of the Rock's pirates, creating monumental chaos in their wake. Then we would have the Navy divided, justice versus blind loyalty. Within the naval force, a fracture also awaits. Just as in God Valley, there were Marines following orders protecting the nobles, the typical government soldiers, and a Garp who acted on his own justice. In the final war, there would be Marines who switched sides upon seeing the truth. We have already seen seeds of this. Smoker questioned things in Arabasta. Fujitora rebelled against the policy of covering up the slave trade in Dressrosa. Aokiji directly deserted. The good faction of the Marines would probably be led by Kobe, who is presented as the heir to Garp's just spirit. In fact, there is Sword, the secret unit where Drake, Kabi, Helmeppo, etc. are, whose purpose seems to be to act outside the corruption of the government. In the final battle, I imagine Kobe and perhaps old heroes like Smoker, Tashigi joining Luffy to overthrow the tyrant. It would be poetic. Kobe at Marineford asked for the end of the war and was almost killed for it. And in the final war, Kobe could directly turn his fist against those who perpetuate injustice, completing the cycle of revolution within the Navy. Cycle that Dragon started in God Valley. On the other hand, there would also be Marines loyal to the established power. Akainu would surely stand firm trying to crush pirates and revolutionaries alike, regardless of whether the boss is IMU or the Gorosei or Teach. Characters like Rob Lucci from CP0 would also fight on the dark side until the end, loyal to oppression. This internal tension could lead to Marines fighting against their own during the war. A possible example could be seeing an Akainu versus Sabo, as we saw an ideological clash during the setback. Then we would have the Revolutionary Army, which would be allied with Luffy. It is almost certain that the revolutionaries would fight side by side with the Straw Hats. In God Valley, there was not yet a revolutionary army as such, since Dragon left there with the seed of that idea. Now, after 20 years of activity, the revolutionaries are a global force. Dragon is captured or killed before the war. His commanders, Ivankov, Belovetti, Lindbergh, Morley, Carasso, would take action under Sabo's leadership. In fact, Sabo is already seen as the Emperor of Flames and an inspiring figure after the false news that he killed Cobra and declared war. The death or capture of Dragon would put Sabo in command of the revolutionaries in battle, along with characters like Konkoala. They would provide strategy and coordination among the allied peoples. I wouldn't be surprised if we see the revolutionaries unite the armies of various oppressed kingdoms to rise against the government during the confusion. For example, affiliated countries suffering celestial taxes could rebel simultaneously. Imagine Dressrosa Province, Sakura declaring independence in support of the revolutionary movement. The final war would have multiple fronts, not just on one island, but global protests and uprisings. But the main front would undoubtedly have them fighting alongside Luffy. A dream battle would be Sabo and Luffy together against some admiral. Let's remember that Sabo already fought against Fujitora in Dressrosa, Luffy with Kizaru, but we have never seen them fight together side by side and seriously. If Dragon survives until the war, obviously he himself would lead his army, but he would be the #1 target of the villains. In any case, the Revolutionary Pirate Alliance would be the embodiment of the liberating army of this era. Other unexpected allies would be these, and here we have characters like Shanks, if he is still alive at this point, Buggy's Cross Guild, and even Luffy's old enemies. And Shanks personally has his own objectives, but he has protected the status in a certain way. He is supposed to have spoken with the Gorosei to warn them about something. However, with his father Garling and his brother Shamrock on the enemy side, it is very likely that Shanks will intervene against them. It may be that Shanks arrives with his entire crew, Beckman, Lucky Rowe, Yasop, and perhaps his role is to stop some threat, maybe face Teach before the Great War and sacrifice himself. I hope not, but it's possible that Shanks might die at the hands of Teach before the final phase, giving Luffy an even more personal motivation to finish off Teach. If Shanks survives for the final war, I imagine a scenario with Shanks leading the vanguard alongside Luffy, or protecting Luffy from some dirty trick by Teach or IMU amidst the chaos. The long-awaited Shanks versus Blackbeard could happen, finally unleashing their rivalry. Teach already gave Shanks the scar some time ago. Or, as I mentioned before, Shanks versus his brother Shamrock in a battle for the soul of the Figureland family. As for the Cross Guild, it deserves a mention, as Buggy made it clear that he dreams of finding the One Piece, even rallying Mihawk and Crocodile to rival Luffy, Shanks, and Teach, and he might see the final war as his chance to mistakenly proclaim himself a hero, or savior, or something like that. Mihawk in particular has loyalty only to himself. However, he hates the government since they pursued him after taking away his title of Shichibukai, and he is a friend, or at least respects Shanks. Crocodile holds a grudge against the government, was imprisoned, and also has an ambition for power, so it is not far-fetched that the Cross Guild might end up tactically allied with Luffy to overthrow the government and then perhaps fight over the spoils. It would be hilarious to see a Buggy pretending to lead an allied army in the middle of a war, with his banner offering bounties for marine heads. Also, if Admiral Fujitora appears, he could interact with the Cross Guild, since Izo is against the corrupt system. Maybe Fujitora pretends to fight them, but ends up joining their cause. Many strange alliances can arise in the final battle. As the common enemy, it will be imposing. Then we have the Giants of Elbaf, and there is a very important factor. Since Whole Cake, we were told that whoever has the Giants on their side will dominate the seas. The world government has been trying for centuries to enlist giants in their ranks. Vegapunk himself researched gigantification by their order. IMU himself apparently believes that having the giants on his side is key to winning the Great War. Currently, Luffy has good relations with Elbaf through Dory and Brogy, the giants from Little Garden who reappeared in Egghead, and also Shanks' alliance with the new generation of giants. It is expected that Elbaf will side with Luffy, as the giants value honor, friendship, and their relationship with the D. We have Jaguar D, Saul, who is also an Elbaf. There is an important detail in the recent chapters, and it is that IMU launched a devastating attack on Elbaf and directly confronted the giant warriors and even Scopper Gaba, who was there. This suggests that Elbaf could suffer significant casualties before the final war, perhaps to weaken its impact on the battle. Even so, surely the most important survivors could lead the giants to join Luffy. Imagine rows of giant warriors charging against the pacifists or against government ships. It would be spectacular. The giants can tip the balance. Perhaps they face some massive government weapon, for example, stopping an ancient giant on the opposing side or knocking down walls. Without a doubt, their presence would fulfill the prophecy. With giants on his side, Luffy would have a huge advantage. Then we have the ancient weapons, Pluton, Poseidon, and Uranus, the most destructive trump cards in the world, and it makes sense to think they would have a role. Poseidon is Shirahoshi, the mermaid princess capable of commanding the giant sea kings. Pluton is a warship located beneath Wano, and Uranus is theorized to be the same weapon that IMU used to erase Lulusia from the map. In the final war, we could very well see these weapons come into play. However, I have a hunch that their use will be early or limited. If one of the sides were to use the full potential of an ancestral weapon at full force, 100%, the battle would be short or unbalanced. For example, Poseidon could submerge entire fleets with an army of sea kings. Pluton could obliterate an island with a single cannon shot. And Uranus, let's not even mention it. We already saw what it did to Lulusia, so to maintain the tension of individual fights and the epic nature of the characters, Oda might make these weapons cancel each other out or be destroyed before the decisive moment. We could have something like Blackbeard, who manages to seize Pluto, stealing it in Wano through someone telling him it's there. Let's remember that Caribou heard about Pluton and mentioned someone he had to inform, and now he's with Teach. With this Pluton, Teach would have a weapon capable of devastating islands, just his style. On the other hand, Luffy would have Poseidon or Shirahoshi as an ally. I imagine a scenario where before the start of the Great War, we have a Pluton versus Poseidon, and they engage in a kind of titanic duel. Teach could attack Sabayoti or some area with Pluton, and Shirahoshi would summon the Sea Kings to stop him. In this fight, it is possible that both weapons will be neutralized, the ship in pieces, perhaps Shirahoshi injured or unable to call more creatures momentarily. That way, when the war on land is at its peak, neither could resort to a cannon shot that wipes everyone out in one go, or the Sea Kings themselves. The fight must be decided the old-fashioned way. Hockey against hockey, fists, swords, and Akuma no Mi. Uranus, on the other hand, could be used by IMU or Teach for an initial devastating act, maybe destroying part of Elba or some rebel base or something like that. But be careful, because Vegapunk's consciousness is still out there and they might find a way to sabotage or neutralize it. There is also the possibility that Frankie fulfills Tom-san's dream by using the Pluton blueprints he memorized to build something that counters the original Pluton or Uranus. It would be great to see the Sunny modified with ancient technology. In any case, the ancient weapons will appear, yes, but Oda will be careful that they don't potentially steal all the spotlight from the heroes. They will rather be elements to add drama, for example. A shot from Pluton destroying something beloved that further motivates Luffy, or to force the alliance of factions, everyone against the weapon before continuing to fight each other. With all these players on the board, the final war of One Piece promises to be a monumental chaos, the climax of all the themes of the series. Freedom against oppression, inherited will versus fear, friendship versus hatred, destiny versus free will. Each key piece seems to be already placed or anticipated by Oda, as I have tried to explain. It is no coincidence that so many current elements repeat patterns of past events. Oda has been building this cyclical parallelism for a long time, so that when we are in the middle of the final war, fans can recognize and say, oh look, this is like Marineford but on a grander scale. Oh look, what's happening is what we couldn't fully see in God Valley. It would be a great rhyme of history. During this final war, we might see certain surprises or interesting details, and the truth of the Void Sentry, for example, could be revealed to the world. More than a surprise, it is a goal. Robin and the knowledge of the poneglyphs will surely come to light. Perhaps in the middle of the final battle, IMU or Teach might try to suppress the truth, and it will be crucial to protect Robin so she can spread it. I imagine a scene of Robin reading the Rio poneglyph and using a Denden Mushi to broadcast the message to the whole world and convey the true story of Joy Boy and the ancient kingdom under the government's tyranny. This would demoralize many Marines and ignite the revolutionary spark on every island. This could be the moral blow that collapses the regime, complementing Luffy's physical victory over IMU or Teach. Then we would have the D. And destiny. Surely we will finally know what the will of D means, the one shared by Luffy, Teach, Garp, Roger, Rox, etc. Many interpret it as dawn or destiny, which we have mentioned before, and it's that Whitebeard, upon dying, said, the legacy of the D will continue to wage war. It may be that we basically discover a formal prophecy about Joy Boy or Toki leaving a message about the year in which the Great War would occur. Let's remember that Toki jumped to the future and died predicting the arrival of the new dawn 20 years later. All these threads would come together. I wouldn't be surprised if Luffy, at some crucial moment, is literally the embodiment of destiny. For example, that the ancient spirits of Willbearers, Roger Joy Boy, symbolically manifest behind him in the final fight. Something like saying, we are with you. Or maybe it's too much of a shonen cliche, but come on, Oda loves mythological drama. Then we have the sacrifice of a symbol. It could even be someone like the red-haired one. It could be anyone, but we might have someone who, for example, dies protecting Luffy from an attack by Teach, explaining the sacrifice of Ace at Marineford. But this time, as I say, with Shanks or Garp giving their life to stop even Akainu or Teach and save their grandson this time. Any of those deaths would further ignite Luffy's determination at the climax. Oda usually hits hard in those acts. He already did it with Ace, Yasuya, and Wano, so we can prepare for possible tears before victory. In short, the keys to the final war are already planted in the story. God Valley and Marineford gave us the structure, beginning with a kidnapping, defined sides, internal betrayals in the villain's side. Let's remember that Ochoku betrayed Rox by selling out Shaki. Squardo briefly betrayed Whitebeard by deceiving Akainu, surprising appearances that decide the course, Garp who suddenly appeared in God Valley, Shanks who appeared to stop the war, and an outcome that marks the entire change of the era. The final war will take all that and push it to the extreme. Oda has been playing with the concept of destiny in a very subtle way, so that in the end everything makes an impressive sense. When we see the Great War unfold, many will say this was already hinted at 500 chapters ago. It will be like fitting the last piece of a puzzle that is right in front of us. In conclusion, the theory of a cyclical destiny in One Piece, where events from the past are reflected in the future, is more relevant than ever. It's not that the story repeats exactly, but that there is a kind of cosmic script in the world, and it's the will of D. Always finds a bearer, darkness always has a face, and very soon Teach, and that the clash between them is inevitable until the cycle of oppression is broken. Oda has been preparing us for that decisive moment using historical parallels, God Valley against Marineford, and references to destiny in the words of characters. We know that this time is different. Joy Boy has returned. The table is set with all the pieces. The Poseidon weapon awakens, allies of all kinds, IMU revealed, and even the enemy senses it. The last Great War will be the climax where that destiny is finally fulfilled or broken. Personally, it excites me to think about how Oda could surprise us even knowing this general framework, because if there is something that characterizes One Piece, it is that, even though we know where we are going, Luffy will face the final villain and seek the One Piece, and how we get there always exceeds our expectations in creativity and excitement. Perhaps the final war will bring unexpected twists, like the appearance of the original Joy Boy in a flashback that inspires everyone in the present, or the liberation of thousands of slaves from Mary Joaz joining the revolt. Anything is possible. In any case, it is clear that Eiichiro Oda has woven his story like a great circle. Ancient events shape future events, and the concept of destiny gives the saga an aura almost of epic legend. We are approaching the moment when that destiny will fully manifest in the narrative, and if the clues do not deceive us, the final war of One Piece will be an event so colossal and so full of moments parallel to God Valley, it will blow our minds. As Oda said, Marineford will seem like just a tale or something cute compared to what's coming. Buckle up and enjoy the journey towards the dawn, because we are about to witness the culmination of this era of pirates, where, now indeed, the fate of the entire world will be decided, and this time, Luffy and his allies will manage to break the cycle. The vicious circle from 800 years ago will finally close, giving way to a new beginning full of freedom, the dawn that so many have awaited.